"A blind black kid sneaking into this hall?" a cop hissed, jabbing his baton into the boy's chest. Victor Stein sneered, his voice cold as steel. "Whether you sit still or get on that piano, all you'll do is make a fool of yourself. So go on, kid. Entertain us." The audience burst into laughter, a few clapping mockingly, eyes bearing down like they meant to crush him. His mother clutched his shoulders and shouted, "You think power gives you the right to trample his dreams?" A spotlight locked onto Eli, his tiny hand resting on the piano keys amid the jeers, and in one more moment, the entire hall would be torn apart. The Grand Hall of New York City blazed under golden lights pouring from a towering crystal ceiling. Rows of red velvet seats stretched out like a proud river, draped in elegant evening wear. The scent of luxury perfume mingled with rhythmic whisper, as if this place belonged to a world entirely separate from the one outside. People came not only to hear music, but to flaunt power and status, to witness an evening where music was worn like a spiritual jewel by the elite. On stage, the gleaming grand piano waited in silence for the hands they called legendary. As the bell rang to announce the start of the concert, the crowd rose to their feet, waves of applause crashing like thunder. Backstage doors opened, and Victor Stein emerged with the unhurried gait of someone certain of being admired. He was 60 years old, with silver hair carefully groomed, a weathered face lit by a familiar arrogance in his eyes. His tailored black suit and gold watch glinting at his wrist formed the image of a living monument. Victor held his head high, approached the piano, bowed slightly, and the audience erupted again in feverish excitement. Shouts of his name echoed as if he were the very soul of the night, the one who would decide how far music could reach. In the last row, two small figures sat surrounded by all that opulence. Eli Carter, a 12-year-old boy, thin and hidden behind thick dark glasses, sat close beside his mother. His white cane rested against the seat, his hand trembling slightly as he listened to the murmur around them. Marcia Carter placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze watching the crowd cautiously, as if one wrong move would get them thrown out. She knew they didn't belong to this world of capes, silk gowns, and smug smiles, but she couldn't deny her son's longing. Eli once told her that every time he heard piano music, he saw light piercing the eternal darkness in his eyes. And tonight, with Victor Stein performing, he wanted to hear it live, to feel his heart tremble to the core. But the upper world didn't welcome their presence so easily. A security guard patrolling near the back row paused when his eyes landed on Eli, longer than necessary. He smirked, leaned in, and whispered with forced disdain loud enough for others to hear, "What's a blind black kid doing here? Begging for music?" A few nearby audience members chuckled softly, as if it were an amusing remark. Marcia tightened her grip on her son's hand, her eyes flashing with restrained fury, knowing that any strong reaction could get them removed immediately. Eli tilted his head toward the voice, his expression unreadable, calm, but his small hands clenched the cane harder, turning pale under the golden lights. Victor Stein sat down before the piano, and the noise vanished instantly. He placed his long fingers on the keys, the hall holding its breath in anticipation. But just as he was about to begin the prelude, he paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience before stopping at the distant corner where Eli sat. His lips curved slightly, as if the boy's presence were an annoying ink smudge on the velvet canvas of the evening. "There are some," he said loudly enough for many to hear, "who think that merely sitting in this hall makes them music lovers. But loving music and understanding music are two very different things." A few murmurs of agreement, a few dry chuckles followed, and Eli knew exactly who the target was. He sat up straight, drawing in a long breath. In his ears, there were no longer whispers of contempt, but distant echoes of piano keys he had once explored in the old living room back in the Bronx. On nights when his mother came home late from work, Eli would sit alone by the discarded piano from the neighbors, learning each note by memory. He couldn't see light, but every note that rang out felt like a flash in his mind, illuminating the entire world. And now that world was being threatened by the arrogance of a powerful man. Again the policeman spoke up, louder this time. "Mr. Stein, maybe let the blind kid try a little piece. Might be good fun for the audience." Laughter broke out across the hall, with some whistling and others clapping at the mock suggestion. Victor Stein didn't respond right away. He raised an eyebrow, scanning the crowd's reaction. He knew the audience loved a spectacle, and a little ridicule sometimes raised the stature of the one who held the stage. He waved his hand, voice sweet, but laced with poison. "Fine. If the boy truly loves music, let him come up. But remember, it's just for fun." The atmosphere swelled, a mix of excitement and cruelty. Marcia froze, wanting to keep her son seated, but Eli tilted his head and whispered, "Let me, Mom." She looked at him, saw the corner of his mouth curl in a calm smile, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the urge to touch the keys glowing under the lights. Marcia exhaled, her chest tightening with both fear and pride, then let go of his hand. The entire hall fell silent, leaving only the slow footsteps of Eli, and the soft tapping of his white cane against the wooden floor. That small sound echoed through the grand space, sending an unexpected chill through many in the audience. His shoes touched the edge of the stage, his hand feeling for the piano's frame. There was a breathless pause, everyone waiting for the collapse they could laugh at. Victor Stein folded his arms, squinted with a faint smirk, and let out each word with dripping sarcasm. "Careful, kid. That piano's worth more than your whole neighborhood." A few laughs followed, the mood both cruel and eager. Eli tilted his head slightly, drew a deep breath, and inside him the music had already gathered, pent up for years. Beneath the brilliant golden lights, a blind black child stood alone, facing a hall full of powerful people sneering down at him. But his hand began to rise, reaching for the keys. And in that moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, expecting a joke, unaware that a storm was about to erupt. In the grand hall adorned with radiant crystal chandeliers, golden light poured down on the elegant rows of seats, and the soft murmurs of the upper-class audience echoed like background music for a concert nearing its climax. The atmosphere was maintained with refined order, everyone attentively watching each movement on stage. Every nod, every quiet laugh was carefully restrained to preserve a sense of elegance. Yet in the midst of that dazzling air, a dry, jarring sound rang out, heavy and misplaced. It was the sound of Eli Carter's white cane accidentally striking the leg of a wooden chair. The small thunk echoed like a bell, tearing through the delicate veil of silence. A few heads turned, a few brows furrowed in annoyance, as if the presence of the blind child had polluted an otherwise perfectly staged picture. Victor Stein, the renowned pianist preparing for his next performance, immediately noticed the interruption. He frowned, his eyes landing on Eli seated with his mother in the back row. That gaze was cold, as sharp as it was full of contempt. To Victor, anything that disrupted the sanctity of the concert was unforgivable. But this time, his irritation wasn't just about the noise, it was about the one who made it, a blind black boy. In Victor's subconscious, that was the image of weakness, of imperfection, undeserving of presence in a hall filled with the powerful and the wealthy. He walked slowly toward the back of the auditorium, the sound of his leather shoes tapping on the wooden floor forming a hard, clipped rhythm that made many look up. The lively atmosphere turned still, then shifted into a tense anticipation. When Victor stopped in front of Eli's row, he leaned forward, voice steady and laced with mockery. "You here to listen, or to be a joke?" The short question landed like a thrown blade, making a few people chuckle under their breath. That laughter spread quickly, and the audience began murmuring. Some tilted their heads to look at Eli with a mix of pity and ridicule. In their eyes, the boy's presence was out of place, like a wrong note in a flawless symphony. From many corners of the hall, the whispers grew louder. "What does a blind kid know about music anyway?" muttered a middle-aged man, deliberately loud enough for several nearby rows to hear. A young woman in a blazing red evening gown shrugged, her voice soft but cutting. "Who let him sit here? This isn't a place for pity. This is where we experience art." Those words hit like sharp blade, making the air in the auditorium feel heavier. Eli sat still, his small hands gripping the white cane tightly, fingers trembling, though his face remained composed. Only the slight tightening at the corners of his lips betrayed his struggle against the invisible weight pressing down from 100 watching eyes. Marcia Carter, Eli's mother, sat beside her son, feeling the tension thickening around them. She gently placed her slender hand on Eli's shoulder, offering a quiet kind of strength. She knew her son had grown used to stares and cruel remarks, but she also knew his young heart could still be hurt. Marcia lifted her head, eyes glowing with resolve. She didn't shout to defend him, didn't leap up to argue. She simply said, calm and firm, "My son loves the piano." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried just enough for those nearby to hear, its tone cutting clean through the whispering crowd. It wasn't a plea, and it wasn't an excuse. It was a simple truth, a belief that no one could dismiss. Victor stood still for a few seconds, then let out a faint laugh. He looked at Marcia with a hint of mockery in his eyes, as if she had said something naive in a room full of true connoisseurs. He turned to Eli, the corner of his mouth curling into a smug smile. "Then play," he said, "just for fun." The words echoed, a command wrapped in sarcasm. For Victor, this was the easiest way to turn Eli's presence into entertainment for the audience. A little show before they returned to bowing before his genius. He was sure the blind child wouldn't respond, that confusion, failure, and laughter would quickly crush whatever flicker of hope remained. The audience stirred again, this time louder, many looking at Eli with eyes expecting a tragic scene. Someone laughed outright. Others shook their heads in exasperation, treating it like a side act. The crystal chandeliers above still sparkled, but the atmosphere below thickened with judgment and disdain. All of it was built into a massive pressure bearing down on the boy sitting quietly among the crowd. Eli took a deep breath, his trembling hands slowly tightening around the cane. He said nothing, But the silence wasn't fear, it felt like preparation. In his mind, the jeers rang out like low notes in a composition, making his desire to prove that music knew neither light nor darkness even stronger. Marcia kept her hand on his shoulder, her steady gaze a silent flame warming him, helping him face the brutal crowd before him. Victor stepped back, arms crossed, that arrogant smile still fixed in place. He believed he had cornered Eli, but somewhere in that tense atmosphere, a quiet shift began. Though most still waited for failure, some in the crowd found themselves holding their breath, wondering if the boy would dare to rise. And it was that sudden stillness, after all the mocking noise, that turned this moment into something fateful. The entire hall seemed caught in a power play with Victor at the center, but Eli and Marcia were quietly rewriting the rule. Because when pushed to the edge of scorn, you either fall or rise, and this moment would open the path for the story to become an unexpected anthem. No one imagined the early laughter would soon fall silent in the face of a power in music waiting to be unleashed from those small hands. In the hall, stretched tight like a drumhead, every whisper echoed beneath the towering arched ceilings, and the golden light from the chandeliers poured down, revealing every detail like a haunting painting. In that space, Eli Carter walked slowly, the tapping of his white cane striking the wooden floor with a cold, rhythmic beat. Each step was a challenge, a declaration of presence, a signal to the entire hall that something was about to happen. His frail body looked almost swallowed by the sea of people dressed in opulence, but that very smallness made him the center of every gaze. Every breath seemed held, and a heavy silence blanketed the room, like a storm gathering before it breaks. That moment was torn apart when a security officer, the same one who had mocked him earlier, decided to turn the situation into a spectacle. He strode forward, his boots pounding loudly against the floor, and stopped just behind Eli. His coarse hand landed heavily on the boy's shoulder, giving a push disguised as harmless, yet soaked in contempt. His voice rang out, each word sharp, carrying nothing but scorn. "Come on, put on a little show for us. The whole hall is waiting for the special performance." A murmur spread. Some people smiled in anticipation, some eyes lit up with delight, as if they had bought tickets to a rare scene. The shove threw Eli off balance. His small frame staggered forward, the cane hitting the floor with a loud crack. He tried to steady himself, but his trembling legs misstepped, sending him off kilter. The sight sparked it. Laughter exploded across the hall. Harsh, rising, echoing off the arches, the sound fell like arrows through the fragile silence. Some covered their mouths with handkerchiefs, but their curled lips betrayed the pleasure. This was no longer just a reflexive laugh. It was the cruel enjoyment of a crowd watching someone be humiliated under dazzling lights. Marcia Carter shot to her feet, her heart clenched tight, her vision blurred with rage and pain. She moved to rush toward her son, but was instantly frozen by the cold stare of another security officer. No words were needed. His look alone forced her back down. Her hands gripped the armrest, nails digging deep into the soft velvet until the fabric warped. Her whole body trembled, not from fear, but from rage held back. A bitter helplessness at watching her son be publicly disgraced by an entire hall. Victor Stein sat before the piano, his demeanor disturbingly calm. He folded his arms, chin slightly raised, eyes fixed on Eli like a cold judge awaiting the condemned to approach the gallows. A sharp, twisted smile played on his lips, cutting straight into the boy's fragile pride. Victor's voice rang out evenly, not loud, but clear enough to reach every corner of the hall. "This piano is worth a fortune. Let's hope you don't ruin it. Has someone who's never seen light any idea of what he's standing in front of?" As his words faded, the audience erupted again. Whistles stretched out, scattered claps cracked like whips through the already suffocating air of contempt. Many looked at Eli as if he were a criminal, and the crowd's shared derision made the mockery hit even harder. Eli stood still, taking a long breath. His small hands clenched the cane so tightly the knuckles turned white, bones showing through the thin skin. But he didn't say a word, lips pressed shut, his face aimed directly toward where Victor's voice had come from. In the eternal darkness of his eyes, Eli had learned how to listen, turning every sound into guidance. The laughter, the whispers, the cruel jabs, all blended into a clear map inside his head. He didn't respond, knowing that any words he spoke now would be twisted into a joke. Eli knew only music had the power to cut through the ropes binding him. Only music could turn humiliation into a reply that forced the world to fall silent. He raised his cane and took slow steps forward. Each one was a battle, not just with his frail body, but with the weight of hundreds of stairs pressing down from above. The tapping of the cane echoed with a steady rhythm, slow but sure, like a war drum before a charge. The laughter continued, but grew thinner. Not because people had stopped mocking, but because everyone wanted to see how far this act would go. A man in the middle rows leaned toward his friend, voice gleeful. "Just wait. He'll pound the keys like a cat clawing at glass." The other scoffed. "Even if he pulls something off, no one's going to take it seriously. How far can a blind kid go? each word slashed at Marcia's ears, every sentence like a needle piercing a mother's heart. The grand piano on stage glowed under the lights like a throne set at the center of the hall. Eli approached, his hand feeling along its edge. He paused for a moment, touching the smooth, cold surface of the polished wood. It was something strange yet familiar, like a dream drawn 1,000 times in his mind. The hall fell silent, not the silence of respect, but the silence before an expected fall. All eyes fixed on those thin hands, smirks clinging to faces. The entire room wound tight, waiting for the sound of a wrong note to snap the tension. Victor leaned forward, eyes locked on Eli. In his mind, the scene played out clearly. The boy would strike the wrong key, a jarring sound would erupt, the audience would burst into laughter, and he would step in, correct the notes, and be hailed as the savior. He would be celebrated, while Eli would be erased from memory like a bad joke. The thought made his smug smile tighten, like a man already certain of victory. But Eli didn't hear those calculations, didn't see the sneering eyes or mocking smile. He only heard his own pounding heartbeat, his mother's restrained breathing at the back of the hall, and the echo of his cane still tapping in his mind like a guiding beat. Above all, he heard the bloodthirsty silence cloaking the room, the silence he knew he would tear apart with a single note. Marcia clenched both hands, Eli's words echoing in her mind. "Music is my eyes, Mom." She looked at her son, his small frame standing firm before the enormous piano, and felt both pain and pride. She knew he wouldn't back down, because within Eli was a quiet strength no crowd could ever understand. Eli set the cane aside and reached forward. His slender fingers trembled as they touched the cold key. In that moment, a few snickers rose again, whistles slicing the air like arrows, all waiting for the ending of a pathetic performance. But Eli stayed silent, his small shoulders rising and falling with a long breath. He was ready. And in the middle of that public humiliation, he would make the world fall silent, in a way no one expected. Golden light from the high-hanging chandeliers poured down on the stage, casting the grand piano like a sacred treasure, gleaming in the space thick with authority. Rows of red velvet seats stretched out, and the audience sat upright in expensive attire, eyes fixed on the stage as if witnessing a public trial, where the fate of a blind boy was up for judgment. The tapping of Eli Carter's white cane had gone still, replaced by his sharp, shallow breathing mixing with the dense air, where even the smallest movement could set off an explosion in the silence. In that moment, Eli reached out, slowly, searching, and when his fingertips touched the cold keys, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. He could not see the light, but he felt every detail, the chill of ivory, the smoothness beneath his skin, and above all, the trembling of his own hands, locked tight like they might shatter. At the back of the hall, a security officer leaned into his seat, lips curled in mockery. He let out a long, sharp whistle that cracked the taut silence like a snapped string. "Hurry up! The whole hall's waiting for the comedy act," he said, and immediately the soft ripple of laughter spread through the rows. A few covered their mouths, some shook their heads, but most let the mockery bleed into the air, as if used to turning someone else's pain into entertainment. That whistle was like a whip, striking Eli's fragile pride and making his hands tremble even more. Victor Stein sat above, relaxed, yet commanding. He tilted his head, icy eyes locked on the boy below. His voice rang out, even and clear, not loud but sharp enough to cut through the space. "Just a few notes, so we can get back to the real performance." His words were a sentence, half mercy, half trap. The audience fell silent in unison, as if they all understood the show was about to begin. That silence was heavier than any laughter. It pressed into Eli's chest, like the invisible weight of 100 watching eyes. Eli took a deep breath, fingers still resting on the keys, feeling their chill seep into his skin. His small hands trembled uncontrollably, not only from pressure, but from the burden of contempt waiting to erupt. In his mind, a storm of sound echoed, the sharp whistle, the scattered scoffs, the hidden whispers laced with cruelty. But within that chaos, Eli found the rhythm of his heart, fast but steady, like a small drum guiding him forward. He heard his mother's held breath at the back of the hall, heard the tremble in it, part pain, part encouragement. Marcia Carter sat in the back row, her hands tightly clasped, fingernails digging so deep into her skin they drew blood. She didn't dare blink, as if even a moment's distraction would cause her son to collapse under the crushing pressure. Her heart pounded violently, and Eli's words echoed in her mind. "Music is my eyes." Now she understood this moment was the threshold where Eli would prove that truth. Whatever the outcome, she believed he would not allow himself to become a joke in front of the crowd. But worry gnawed at her, because she knew if Eli Eli failed, today's wound would leave a scar that never faded. In the rows closer to the stage, the audience sat upright, some leaning forward, others with arms crossed, all waiting. It wasn't the eager anticipation of a concert, but the hunger of wolves stalking prey, hoping to see the small creature stumble. Everyone pictured the same ridiculous scene, shrill, chaotic notes tumbling from blind hands. A few exchanged quiet smirks, whispering, "He'll lose the rhythm, just sounds like a cat on the keys." Another replied, "Even if he pulls it off, no one will care. A blind kid's not going far anyway." The venom in their voices reached Marcia's ear, each word a needle piercing her heart, yet she stayed still, pouring every ounce of faith into the small hands resting on the key. Victor frowned, his scrutinizing gaze fixed on Eli's every move. For him, this had turned into a bet, as though he had staked his entire reputation on the boy's failure. He was certain wrong notes would follow, the crowd would laugh, and he would rise, stepping in as the savior to correct each sound. The image was so vivid in his mind that he could already taste the sweetness of victory, but he failed to see that within the fragile silence, something miraculous was quietly taking shape. Eli closed his eyes, though for him, it changed nothing. He could not see the light, but he heard everything, the crowd's breaths, his mother's stifled sob, and most of all, the silence waiting to swallow him whole. Yet he wasn't afraid, because he knew music never betrayed. Darkness might cloud his eyes, but music had given him another vision, clearer than any light shining in that hall. A long breath escaped, and the small shoulders rose, then fell. Eli's fingers trembled, but slowly gathered strength. He knew that with a single touch, everything would shift, the whistles would stop, the mocking smiles would freeze, and this hall would be forced to hold its breath and listen. No one could predict what would come next. But Eli believed in himself, believed in the music that had saved him from darkness all these years. The audience remained silent, the light from above pouring down like thousands of judging eyes. Everyone waited for the deciding moment, the moment they were sure would become a joke. But within that silence, Eli was already prepared to turn it into a marker, a turning point. He placed both hands on the keys, inhaled deeply, heart pounding like a battle drum, and in his mind, only one thing rang out: music would speak for everything. In the stillness of the hall, as every eye focused on Eli Carter's small hand, the boy bowed his head slightly, took a long breath, and let his fingers fall onto the keys. The first note rang out, not shrill or scattered as the crowd had expected, but instead rich, resonant, so deep it reached even those in the farthest seats, shaking through their chests. It wasn't a random strike, nor a joke, but a note that opened a door into another world. That sound carried the tremble of his hand, yet held an extraordinary pull, as if the darkness in his eyes had turned into light flowing through the piano key. The laughter, only moments ago echoing in the room, vanished, snuffed out by something invisible. Everyone froze, and the silence now felt heavier than ever before. The grand space, the glowing chandeliers, all remained, but the lights now seemed only a backdrop to the unexpected melody taking shape. An old man near the aisle, hair silver white and eyes glistening, whispered hoarsely, voice cracking with emotion, "My God, this isn't a joke." His soft words rang clearly in the stillness, jolting many who felt as if they, too, had spoken the same thought inside. No whistles, no smirks. The entire hall sank into a strange state where mockery was choked by disbelief. Victor Stein, who had sat with arms crossed and a calm demeanor, could no longer hide the shift in his eyes. He frowned, startled, one hand twitching on his leg in reflex. He had expected a disaster, but that single note had stopped him cold. It wasn't accidental. It was a sound with soul, the kind only made by someone who had lived with music, not merely touched it for the first time. Victor's chest rose, then fell. He tightened his hands to hide the discomfort, but his gaze on Eli revealed a hesitation he failed to mask. Eli couldn't see the change in their eyes, but he felt the shift in the air. As his fingers moved again, a gentle sequence of notes began to flow, smooth and effortless, like water slipping through stone crevices, gliding down into a quiet valley. No one could believe those trembling hands had produced something so complete. The music rose like a conversation, not only with the audience, but with the darkness Eli had known since birth. He didn't need light to find his way, because music had become his eyes, guiding each rhythm from within. The audience sat upright, faces stunned, many lips moving but no sound coming out. A few leaned toward each other but quickly turned their gaze back to the stage, afraid to miss a single second of what was unfolding. The occasional sigh or dry swallow broke the air, proof that the mockery from before had dissolved into confusion. Those who had waited to laugh now felt like the joke was on them, silenced by the very first note from the blind boy. In the back row, Marcia Carter sat frozen, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She had believed her son could do it, but the moment she heard that sound, it felt like the entire world was being swept away. The memories surged. Days of watching him tap rhythms with small fingers in a dark room. Afternoons spent listening as he practiced on the old piano rescued from the junk heap. And now, in front of hundreds, that same child had turned what once seemed like a dream into something real. Victor Stein remained still, but inside, something shifted. He asked himself what he had just heard. Was it luck, or was it the very talent he had denied, dismissed, believed didn't exist? The lines on his forehead deepened, and his eyes didn't leave the boy. He wanted to believe it was just a fleeting moment, but something in his chest warned him this was the beginning of something beyond his control. Eli kept playing, the rhythm unhurried, unshowy, yet with a pull that wrapped the hall in an unfamiliar silence. This was no longer the silence of waiting for a mistake. It was stunned awe, as if no one dared breathe too hard for fear of breaking the spell. Older members of the audience, seasoned by countless concerts, began to nod subtly, a quiet voice inside them admitting, this was not a trick, this was real music. And with every touch of Eli's fingers on the keys, another layer of doubt peeled away. In that space, every small sound seemed to strike the listeners' hearts directly. Younger audience members fell silent, eyes wide, unsure if what they were witnessing could be real. The whispers were gone now, replaced by steady gazes locked on the stage. A few people slowly lowered hands that had been covering awkward smiles, realizing they no longer had a reason to laugh. Something unseen was forcing them to truly listen. Victor leaned forward slightly, one hand resting on his thigh as if to join in, but it paused. He had never felt so uneasy in a performance. Part of him wanted to believe it was an illusion, that the boy would soon stumble and fall apart. But the confidence in every note forced him to admit, at least to himself, that this boy was no joke. An old man in the front row tilted his head slightly, eyes glowing under the dim lights. He murmured, voice shaky but full of certainty, "My God, this is not a joke." That statement wasn't just his own feeling. It echoed the sentiment of the entire hall. It was a quiet confirmation of the shift taking place, an admission that the blind boy had crossed the line of pity and stepped directly into the realm of true art. Eli kept his head down, his small hands seeming to converse with the keys. He didn't know the hall had gone silent, that the mocking laughter had vanished. In his mind, there was only rhythm, the steady, endless current of music leading the way. For Eli, this moment wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was simply about being true to himself, letting his soul move freely in the world he trusted. And it was that simple truth that created something extraordinary. The grand hall, long used to glamour and spectacle, now bore witness to something rare, the birth of a melody not born of fame or power, but from the pure heart of a boy who had once been dismissed. And from that moment on, every gaze, whether from Victor, the security officer, or the audience members who once sneered, was forced to look at Eli in a new light. A new chapter had begun, and it started with that single, unusual note. The opening note, like a knock on the heart, had silenced the entire hall, but Eli didn't stop there. His hands began to move faster, striking the keys with a precision that stole the breath from every chest. The next notes came in rapid succession, not a simple melody or random improvisation, but a powerful cascade of variations. The sound surged like a river in flood, then softened unexpectedly like a passing breeze. One could hear the smoothness in every transition, a level of finesse far beyond what anyone imagined possible from a blind child. Victor Stein clenched the armrest, his brow furrowed tight. He had prepared for missteps, for off-key moments or clumsy touches, but what was unfolding was the exact opposite. Eli played as if he had trained his whole life for this moment, as if the piano were an extension of his body. The intensity wasn't chaotic. It followed a hidden logic, wildly expressive, bound tightly to the discipline of classical form. Victor couldn't take his eyes off those small hands, once trembling, now sharp and unyielding, cutting straight into his pride. The orchestra seated behind began to shift in strange, subtle ways. They had been invited to support Victor's feature performance, seasoned musicians long accustomed to following the master's lead. But the moment Eli's variation surged, a few players instinctively picked up their instruments, easing in with light, scattered notes. A violin offered a quiet phrase, unable to resist the pull of the music. Then the cello joined, heavy and deep, anchoring itself to the rhythm Eli was creating. No signal was given, no conductor moved, but one by one, they were drawn into the storm. One of the violinists, silver hair falling to his shoulders, murmured in awe, "This boy listens with his soul." The words were soft, barely heard by the colleague beside him, but they echoed the feeling that now filled the room. They no longer saw a blind boy. They saw a true artist, turning pain and darkness into sound. The music spread, each instrument blending in, and the hall transformed into a stage unlike any before. where a child led an orchestra without ever giving a cue. The audience sat dazed, their eyes glazed as if hypnotized. Many had come with proud minds, carrying curiosity mixed with disdain, but now they sat motionless, hearts pulled along with every beat. Some placed their hands over their chests unconsciously, as if trying to hold the rising tide of emotion. A woman in the front row, who had mocked just minutes earlier, now found herself in tears, unable to explain why. She blinked rapidly, but the tears still fell as the piano merged with the orchestra, creating a song that seemed to come from somewhere beyond cruelty itself. Victor Stein sat motionless, his eyes darkening. He could feel control slipping from his grasp. The audience was no longer watching him, no longer waiting for his smile or nod to applaud. They were being led by a blind child. Each note was a slap to his pride, a reminder that music was never a throne for showing off power, but a bridge between souls. Victor had never feared any performance, but in this moment, a chill ran down his spine. Eli had no idea how the audience was looking at him, and he didn't need to. In his eternal darkness, all he heard was music flowing through his veins. He remembered long nights sitting alone at the old piano, letting each note carry him past the loneliness, letting sound become the light that guided his life. And now, all those memories were becoming strength, transforming into a cascade of variations no one had expected. This 12-year-old wasn't playing to prove a point, nor to seek revenge. He was playing to be true to himself, and that was what made the music impossible to resist. The orchestra was now fully immersed, no longer hesitant. Violins soared, cellos hummed low, the soft beat of drums kept the pace, all orbiting around the piano at the center. There was no conductor, no score, only the instinct to follow those blurred hands, as if following a shared heartbeat. The vast hall echoed with sound, so much so that it felt like even the marble walls were vibrating in sympathy. A man in the back row stood up without thinking, eyes closed, letting his body sway with the music. The person beside him moved to stop him, then sat back, overtaken by the same emotion. Those who had waited to laugh now sat stunned, unable to remember why they had ever mocked him. The entire hall, from front row to back, from the powerful to the quiet staff in the shadows, all sank into a current of music that made no distinction. Marcia Carter sat in the very last row, her trembling hand rising to cover her mouth. Her tears fell, not from sorrow, but from overwhelming pride. She had always known her son loved the piano, but she had never imagined that love could light up an entire grand hall, turning a place once full of arrogance into a temple of reverent silence. Eli had done something no one, not even she, had dared to dream. Victor Stein finally exhaled, a heavy breath. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, his gaze no longer fully arrogant. In the golden light, flicker of unease crossed his face. He felt as if he were being pulled down from his royal seat, his authority shaken by a force he couldn't explain. A blind boy now sat in the place he had always believed belonged only to him, and for the first time in many years, he felt truly small. The music continued to rise, each variation opening into a new depth. It was no longer just notes on key, but a story told in a language that needed no light. A story of a boy living in darkness who found his own light. A story that melted every prejudice in the room. In that moment, there were no elites, no ridiculed child, only people, sitting together inside a single piece of music. And when Eli pressed the final notes of the variation, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. They had never experienced anything like this in a concert, being led beyond limits by a child who had never seen light. As the last sound echoed and faded into the air, the silence lingered for several seconds, filled with reverence. Then came the gasps, the choked sob, and at last, the slow, deliberate applause of an elderly musician, a starting gun. The whole hall erupted, applause crashing like a wave, rising to shatter the crystal dome above. Eli remained seated, hand resting gently on the keys, head bowed slightly, seeing no eye, but hearing everything. He heard the hall's heartbeat syncing with his own, and in the darkness, he smiled. The entire hall was still lost in the aftermath of the variation, no one believing that Eli Carter's small hands could have led an orchestra and turned the audience into something spellbound. Eyes remained dazed, hearts still beating to the rhythm of the key, until a sharp sound broke the moment. A chair scraped hard against the wooden floor, jolting the room. Victor Stein, silent like a statue until now, finally stood. His pitch-black suit glowed under the golden lights, his tall figure and commanding presence pulling the room into stillness. He stepped toward the stage, each stride heavy with purpose, eyes locked on Eli, lips curled into a proud, defiant smile. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath, sensing a new storm about to strike. Victor stopped just in front of the grand piano, turned to the crowd, and spoke with a voice deep and resonant like a sentence being passed. If it's real, face me. The challenge wasn't only aimed at Eli. It struck at everyone who had dared to believe in the blind boy. The crowd stirred, tension rising. Some leaned in and whispered, "He's going to prove it was just luck," while another replied, "We're about to watch a child crushed by the hands of a master." The air was so thick that even breathing sounded like a rolling drumbeat. Victor sat down, and the hands that had captivated millions rested on the keys with practiced command. Without warming up, he launched into a difficult piece, a master-level variation laced with traps and sharp turns. His fingers moved like a storm, chords crashing like waves, then falling into long, mournful notes, then rising again in thunderous bursts. It was a perfect blend of technique and experience, a weapon he believed could destroy any challenger. His eyes stayed fixed on Eli, not only to challenge, but to crush him, to prove that the light of art belonged only to those who could see and understand it, while blind children would forever be lost in the dark. The audience was silent at first, then applause and cheers erupted. Many didn't hide their admiration for Victor's skill. Some turned to each other, eyes lit up, whispering, "Now this is the real thing, a level no one else can touch." Excitement swelled, but within that space, Eli remained quiet, his head tilted slightly, ears straining, as if each note were a sentence etched clearly in his mind. He couldn't see Vic, but he could hear everything, every shift, every sudden softness, every pounding rhythm, as if his own hands were moving across the keys. Victor ended his piece with a flurry of chords, hands raised high before slamming down on the keys like a thunderclap. The final sound echoed powerfully, drawing explosive applause from the audience. He lifted his head, lips curled in a confident smile, his eyes sweeping the hall as if declaring victory. Then he turned toward Eli, locking eyes, his voice slow and full of challenge. "Well then, kid, your turn." Eli sat up straight, his small shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from a heart beating faster than ever. He tilted his head, listening closely to the remnants still hanging in the air, each beat, each breath of the finished piece. His hand reached for the keys, slow and careful, as if touching the pulse of a heart. The tension in the room tightened, silence returning, heavier than before, thick with the expectation of a spectacle about to fall apart. Then Eli drew a deep breath, and his hands began to move. His small fingers struck the keys with surprising speed, each note clear, alive, full of intent. He didn't merely repeat what Victor had played. He transformed it, adding his own inflections, lingering in moments of emotion, weaving in subtle variations like wind slipping through a crack, before rising into crashing waves. Eli answered with his own musical voice. Not weak, not scattered, but powerful enough to leave the audience stunned. Victor frowned, first in surprise, then in disbelief. He couldn't trust his ears. The boy wasn't just listening and copying, he was improvising on the spot, as if he understood every layer Victor had embedded in the piece, then turned and elevated it effortlessly. Victor felt as if he were looking into a mirror, seeing a younger version of himself, driven, burning with hunger. But this time, the reflection belonged to a blind child. The audience couldn't contain it. Shouts burst out. "No way!" one man cried. "He's improvising!" Another yelled, voice trembling with emotion. Applause erupted before Eli had even finished. Those who once mocked were now on their feet, eyes wide with awe. Some clutched their head, others covered their mouths to muffle sob. It was as if they were witnessing the impossible, proof that genius could come from where no one dared to look. Eli kept going, his hands gliding lightly but surely, turning each key into the whisper of a soul. He didn't need sight, because music to him wasn't visual. It was heartbeat, breath, light in the darkness. Every note landed like a slap to those who had laughed, every surging chord a declaration. He had not come to be a joke. He had come to show the world that music knows no limits. Victor clenched both hands, a surge of emotion rising inside him that he couldn't name. His pride had been challenged, his arrogance shaken. He felt the truth settle deep. This boy wasn't just on his level. He was taking the music further than anything Victor had just performed. It wasn't only the audience who had been stunned, but Victor himself, as the belief he'd long held, that he stood alone at the top, began to crumble. When Eli ended with a series of perfectly resonant notes, the entire hall erupted. Shouts, applause, and whistles all collided into a storm. People rose to their feet, screamed his name, and clapped until their palms turned red. Many wept, unable to hold back the emotion. They hadn't just witnessed a duel. They had witnessed a moment that redefined music, that redefined fairness in art itself. In the crowd, someone shook their head, eyes wet with tears. "I never thought a blind child could do this." Another held their face, voice trembling. "That boy doesn't hear with his ears. He hears with his soul. And at the back of the hall, Marcia Carter, eyes blurred with tears, hand pressed to her chest to contain the pride swelling inside her, whispered, "My son, you did it!" Victor sat in silence, eyes burning with a storm of feeling. He didn't clap, he didn't smile, but deep down, he knew a door had opened, and from this moment on, he could no longer deny the truth. That boy was his equal, his rival, the living proof that real talent isn't seen through eyes, but through the heart. And as the cheers still rang through the hall, Victor understood that from this moment forward, his life had changed forever. The echo of the improvisation still lingered in the air like wisps of smoke not yet dissolved. The audience, seated on rows of red velvet chairs, had yet to catch their breath. They had just watched a blind boy turn the entire hall into a giant instrument, each heartbeat inside their chests becoming a string that Eli Carter controlled. The cheers, the thunderous applause, the choked sobs of emotion had not fully faded when another sound rang out, cold and trembling, like a blade slicing through the charged air. Victor Stein, who only moments earlier had sat tall in the principal artist's chair, no longer looked composed. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the wooden floor. His whole body seemed frozen, eyes wide, veins bulging across his forehead. He no longer resembled the masterful figure the audience once knew, but a stripped-down man facing a truth too big to deny. His voice broke out, shaking, but loud enough for the entire hall to fall silent and hear, "Who taught you? That's not possible!" The question didn't sound only like astonishment, it was a confession that he couldn't comprehend the miracle he had just witnessed. It was also panic, a fear rising from deep inside, as he realized everything he had built might collapse at the hands of those small fingers. All eyes turned toward Victor, and in him they saw a tremble they had never seen before. For a brief moment, the crystal lights above seemed to shine directly on the first crack in the proud wall Victor had spent decades building. Eli lifted his head, dark glasses reflecting the brilliant light from the stage. He couldn't see, but he knew every eye in the room was on him. While Victor was losing his footing in the storm of emotion, Eli remained strangely calm. His voice rang out, gentle but weighted, each word dropping like a pebble that ripples across still water. "Music is my eyes." The room froze. The words were simple, yet carried a force that couldn't be resisted. They didn't just answer Victor's question, they revealed the truth everyone was witnessing. Eli didn't need a teacher, and he didn't need real eyes, because music had always been his guide. Music was the invisible sight that had led him through darkness, through ridicule, through judgment. And in that moment, it was as if everyone saw themselves reflected in those words, realizing they had just been seen, clearly, by a boy who had never opened his eyes. The silence after Eli's words didn't last long. A shout erupted from the left side of the hall, where the police officer who had once hurled cruel remarks was seated. He shot to his feet, face flushed red, arms flailing, his voice rising as he tried to rip through the reverent atmosphere. "It was just luck. A blind kid better than a master. Are you people serious?" The words struck the room like a punch to the face, followed by a sneering, defiant laugh. But unlike before, the crowd didn't fall into complicit silence. A fierce wave of backlash surged immediately. At first, it was just a few sharp whistles, a few harsh shh sounds from rows near the stage. Then the noise spread like fire catching dry straw. "Shut up," a woman yelled, her voice shaking but firm. "Enough," a man growled, rising to his feet, gripping the armrest. The whole hall erupted, voices shouting, scolding, roaring with such force that the officer froze, his face going pale. He stepped back slowly, both hands gripping his gun belt but making no move to draw it, knowing full well the power in the room had turned against him, and he stood utterly alone. The yelling grew louder, joined by stomping feet, angry whistles, and a fury that shook the air. Under the golden lights, his uniform no longer looked like a symbol of authority, but a flimsy layer masking his humiliation. Meanwhile, Eli remained seated, unshaken by the outburst. His face was calm, as if he'd grown used to such arrows and no longer needed to deflect them, because now, the entire hall stood in his defense. He could hear every shout of support, every angry cry thrown at the officer, and he understood. The music had become a shield around him. Victor still stood, chest heaving, fingers twitching. His eyes no longer held contempt, but shock, confusion, and a flicker of anger mingled with a vague fear. He was trembling, not from rage, but from the realization that, for the first time in his life, he was being defeated by a blind boy. And at that very moment, another voice rose, calm, sharp, slicing through the chaos. Marcia Carter stood from the last row, her frame small but her gaze unshakable. She took a step into the aisle, face turned squarely toward Vic, no trace of hesitation. She spoke, her voice not loud, but cutting straight through the noise, landing in everyone's chest. "You told my son to play for fun, but tell me, who's the one trembling now?" The entire hall fell silent, as if all the air had been sucked out. That question rang out not just as a mother's defiance, but as a verdict. All eyes turned to Victor. They saw his clenched hands, trembling so hard his nails dug into his skin. They saw the tension in his face, his lips pressed tightly to keep from swallowing audibly. The man who once stood like a statue, who had mocked a blind child, now appeared stripped bare, a defeated figure exposed before hundreds. Whispers spread like ripples on water, but this time they weren't aimed at Eli, they were aimed straight at Victor. "He's really shaking. Look at his hand. Who's afraid now?" The room buzzed. Not with mockery toward the boy, but with biting irony aimed at the man who once believed he had the right to humiliate. Victor lowered his head, his face pale, eyes drifting from Eli to the wooden floor. Inside him, Marcia's words repeated like relentless church bells. He wanted to deny them, to fight back, to rebuild the wall of pride that had always shielded him, but he knew it was too late. Eli's music had overturned everything, and the truth now stood in blinding clarity. The one trembling was not the blind boy, but Victor Stein himself. Applause rose again, no longer for the music, but for the moment of reckoning. The audience stood, clapping until their hands burned, some shouting Eli's name in pure emotion. Cries of bravo echoed through the space, blending with choked sobs from those who couldn't hold back their tears. The hall had become a sea of passion, a place where prejudice had been shattered, where a blind boy had become the center of light. Marcia sat down, her hand trembling slightly, but her eyes shining bright. She no longer saw shame aimed at her son, only pride rising like a tide. Eli remained seated at the piano, lips pressed gently, hand resting on his leg, quietly listening to the cheers as if they were a new piece of music, written by hundreds of hearts. And Victor, he stood frozen, eyes closed, letting the thunderous applause bury the pride that had once been his sharpest weapon. In that moment, everyone in the hall understood. A new era had begun. Eli Carter was no longer a blind boy made into a joke, but the one who had silenced the world, who had made the one who mocked him bow his head in fear. And in that very moment, Marcia's words echoed endlessly. "You told my son to play for fun, but who's the one trembling now?" A sentence that became a sentence, etched into the hearts of all who were there, a reminder that truth sometimes comes from those we once dared to look down on. The tense silence in the hall after Marcia's words lasted barely a breath before she spoke again, this time more slowly, as if every word were meant to pierce Victor's pride like a blade. She looked directly at the man standing on stage, her voice steady and unexpectedly clear. "Did you know my son once knocked on the door of your academy? He asked to be admitted, pleaded for a chance, but that door slammed shut in his face with a single judgment: not suitable." Her final words echoed through the vast space like a sudden verdict falling from above. A stir ran through the audience, whispers crashing into one another until the air grew thick. Some covered their mouths, others slumped back in their seats, eyes wide with disbelief. Until now, they had only witnessed a musical duel between a master and a blind child. But now, the story had turned a page, revealing a truth that lit up a hidden corner of the elite world. Marcia said no more. She stepped back, letting her words carve their own path through the room. Around the hall, many eyes turned toward Victor. They wanted his response, wanted to know if he had truly taken part in such a cruel decision. An elderly man in the front row, his hair white as snow, muttered just loud enough for several nearby rows to hear, "If this is true, we destroyed a genius at the doorstep." Solemn nods followed one after another, and the weight in the room grew heavier than any swell of music could bring. Victor stood frozen, his face rigid, but the lack of reaction only fanned the flames. Before he could open his mouth, someone in the audience let out a startled cry. "My God! Stein was on the Academy selection board!" Another voice chimed in immediately. "That's right, he's always claimed to have the final say in every decision." A collective gasp followed, rising like a crashing wave, drowning whatever defense Victor might have had left. Marcia remained where she stood, her gaze calm, but her voice sharp as a blade. "You once sat in that prestigious chair and declared there was no room in music for a blind child. And now, you're the one trembling before his piano." Her words dropped like a hammer, and the hall exploded. Someone slammed a hand against a chair, another cried out, and others turned to their neighbors, faces flushed with fury. Amid the chaos, Eli remained still at the piano, his hands lightly clasped, not from fear, but because old memories had come rushing back. He remembered that day clearly, when his mother brought him to the academy, both of them standing for hours in a cold room, waiting for a verdict. He had hoped, he had longed, but the men and women in expensive clothing took one glance, then crossed out his name with a single phrase: "Not suitable." No one gave him a chance to touch the keys. breathe. No one listened to a single note, choosing instead to close the door on his dream simply because he was blind. And now, those very people who once denied him were sitting here, listening with their whole hearts, trembling before the very thing they once rejected. Victor took a deep breath, his eyes unfocused, his hand twitching as if to protest, but no words came. The truth was too evident, and his silence became its own confession. The audience no longer looked at him with admiration, but as if they were staring at a man on trial. A middle-aged woman near the aisle spoke with a sharp, cutting voice. "You blocked that boy's path. If he hadn't stood up today, we would never have known the Academy made such a terrible mistake." Her words echoed, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement. The room filled with whispers, but unlike the mocking laughter from the beginning, this time they were full of anger and regret. Some wept, others lowered their heads. That vast space had turned into an invisible courtroom, and Victor Stein suddenly became the accused. He was no longer seated on the throne of music, but stood under the blinding light of truth, where everyone now knew he had played a part in rejecting a genius. Eli sat still, his expression calm, a faint smile touching his lips. He had no need to speak further. His mother had already spoken, and the audience understood. The truth had been laid bare, and from this moment on, no one would ever see Victor Stein the same way again. The hall, once a stage of power and pride, had become a place where the shadows of the past were exposed, and from within that shadow, the light of a blind child had become the brightest flame. The murmurs grew louder, at first just a few voices, then quickly rising into open condemnation. An older man slammed his hand on the armrest, his voice bursting out like a drumbeat across the vast space. "You stole a genius's chance!" As his words fell, many others joined in, a wave of outrage rising. "That's right! Who gave you the right to judge with your eyes instead of listening to the music?" A young woman in the third row shot to her feet, her eyes wet but blazing with fury, and shouted, "If he hadn't proved himself today, we would have let this talent be buried in darkness, all because of the blind prejudice of those in power." The outrage spread quickly, rippling from the front rows to the very back as the audience stirred, each person seeking a way to express their indignation. People stomped their shoes against the floor. Some pointed directly at Victor. Others burst into tears at the thought of a child whose dream had nearly been crushed. The atmosphere in the concert hall transformed completely, from a space once filled with mocking laughter into a public courtroom where hundreds of voices rose in condemnation. No one looked at Eli with pity anymore, but with admiration, while Victor, once seated at the highest pedestal, now stood cornered, like a criminal under siege. Victor Stein stood frozen, his face draining of color, each wrinkle seeming to deepen under the brilliant lights. His hands trembled slightly, hidden beneath his tailored suit, but no one missed the unsteadiness of a man once seen as invincible. His head felt heavy, his ears rang beneath the pounding voices of dissent. The prestige he had built over decades, the reputation once praised by adoring fans, now wavered violently before their eyes. No one called him a genius anymore. They saw him as a man at fault, one who had used power to silence a rising voice. An elderly musician who had shared many performances with Victor sat in the guest section and slowly shook his head, his worn voice cutting through a brief pause. "You prided yourself on upholding the standards, but you let those standards become chains that bound the children." The people around him nodded, and a few sighs escaped. Victor lowered his gaze, avoiding their eyes, but every motion he made only highlighted his diminishing authority. Meanwhile, Eli remained seated in silence, hands resting neatly on his lap, his head slightly bowed as if listening to the noise rippling through the hall. He said nothing, yet his calm presence seemed to fuel the crowd's fury even more. It became clear to everyone that this child didn't need to speak. His very existence was a living testament to the mistake Victor had made. All eyes turned toward the man, no longer with sympathy, only with the heavy weight of judgment. Victor drew in a deep breath, but it came out strained, as if compressed by the air itself. He knew he was standing on the edge, knew his reputation was collapsing inside the very hall he once believed to be his kingdom. The same people who once worshipped him now rose in condemnation, the applause that had celebrated him now replaced by a storm of rejection. He felt the mask of confidence he had long worn beginning to crack, its fragments falling beneath the burning gaze of hundreds. And he, Victor Stein, for the first time, faced the truth. His musical authority was no longer an untouchable fortress. The noise in the hall hadn't yet died down when Victor Stein raised his head, his eyes bloodshot with a mix of rage and fear. He stepped toward the piano, his voice low and heavy, each word falling like a stone. "If you're truly gifted, play Concerto Number 21. The entire hall froze, the air seeming to vanish as if sucked out of the room. They knew this was no simple challenge. It was the pinnacle of classical repertoire, a test even seasoned performers approached with caution. Whispers rippled out. Someone gasped, "He's insane!" insane, asking a blind child to play concerto number 21 on the spot? Some faces showed unease, but others held a flicker of anticipation, curious to see if the miracle would repeat itself. Eli Carter remained still, his small hand resting on the key, his face behind dark glasses calm and composed. He tilted his head slightly, lips curling into a quiet, serene smile, as though he had just been handed the chance to say something long held inside. Without a word, Eli began the prelude, his fingers gliding over the piano with a lightness and precision that unfolded the opening notes of the concerto. The hall fell utterly silent. No more mocking laughter, no more doubt, every ear drawn to the sound. The opening notes rang out like a declaration, firm yet gentle, then quickly surged into a powerful current. Eli didn't strain, didn't show off. He let the music guide his hands. The trembling fingers from earlier had grown strong, each note resounding with quiet confidence. The audience sat stunned, brows furrowed in disbelief, some clutching their chests as they felt their hearts beat in time with the music. An old man in the front row, eyes glistening with tears, whispered, "The boy, he's living inside Mozart." Victor stood beside him, his expression gradually shifting. He wanted to believe it was luck, but the more he listened, the clearer the truth became. Eli wasn't simply recreating the music, he was breathing his own soul into it. Each crescendo surged like waves, only to settle into cool, gentle breezes. The 12-year-old blind boy had transformed the immortal concerto into a dialogue between darkness and light, between loss and hope. The orchestra behind him, hesitant at first, began picking up their instruments one by one, quietly joining in. They needed no conductor, they followed the music. Violins rose, cellos sang, clarinets danced, all entwining around the piano at the center. The seamless harmony lit up the entire hall, the sound flowing into every corner, echoing off the crystal dome and cascading down over the audience below. A young woman who had previously kept her eyes fixed on Victor now sat with tears welling up, whispering, "This is a concerto I've never heard played like this before." Beside her, a wealthy businessman sat frozen, his hand gripping the chair, his face twisted as if realizing too late he had mocked a genius. The music soared, sweeping away every trace of doubt and malice, leaving behind only one emotion: reverence. Eli continued to lead the hall through layers of music, from gentle passages to powerful bursts, making every heart beat in unison. Some closed their eyes, others gripped the hands of those next to them, and more than a few let their tears fall freely. This was no longer a performance, but a liberation, a declaration that music belongs to those who dare to live fully for it, no matter who chooses to look down on them. When Eli played the final note, the sound lingered and faded into silence, and the hall fell into absolute stillness. Everyone held their breath, hearts pounding, too stunned to applaud. Then a single clap rang out from the back, followed by dozens, then hundreds, until the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause, roaring like a storm. People jumped to their feet, stomped the floor, and shouted his name. Cries, cheers, and claps blended into a massive sound that drowned out every last shred of arrogance. Victor Stein stood frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling, eyes locked on Eli as if he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. In all his career, no one, least of all a child, had ever reduced him to such insignificance. And now, before hundreds of witnesses, he was forced to accept that his authority had collapsed, while the name Eli Carter was forever etched in glory by the very concerto number 21 that had just rung out like a victorious bell. The music surged again, each note stacking like waves, pulling the entire hall into a journey beyond boundaries. The familiar melodies of the concerto came alive in a way they never had before, as Eli breathed into them a different soul, complex, fierce, yet deeply emotional. His playing swept away every lingering doubt, silencing skeptical eyes, replacing them with focused awe. The audience wasn't just listening, they were swept into the current, carried by the rise and fall of each passage. From the front row to the back, not a single person dared look all. Every lifted chin and held breath tethered to the small hands commanding the piano. Victor Stein still stood nearby, his face growing increasingly tense. He could no longer find anything to cling to. The complex layers of technique he believed would corner the child were now being absorbed and transformed into something beyond expectation. He no longer felt like he was facing a 12-year-old boy, but an equal opponent, perhaps even more dangerous, because this opponent wasn't playing to prove himself. He was playing with a survival instinct. The music pressed into Victor's chest, tightening his throat, an unfamiliar sensation he thought he'd long been immune to. The audience began to shift. Some wiped at their eyes. Others leaned forward in their seats as if trying to move closer to the source of light emanating from those hands. The polyphonic textures blending with the orchestra, now following voluntarily, shook the room, the crystal dome ringing in resonance. Gone was the formal composure of a typical elite concert. They sat mesmerized, hypnotized, then suddenly erupted in uncontainable awe. An elderly woman gripped her daughter's hand, whispering through tears, "That boy is playing with his soul. No one can deny it." As the piece reached its climax, Eli struck a full chord, its sound bursting like fireworks across a night sky. The music rang out, echoing through every corner, touching every heart. The hall, which had held its breath in silence, exploded. Rows of spectators leapt to their feet. Applause thundered like a storm, relentless and unending. People clapped until their hands stung. Some wept uncontrollably, tears falling unchecked. They no longer saw a powerless child before them, but an artist who had shattered the chains of prejudice and stepped straight into history. The entire hall surged with emotion. Cries and sobs, mixing with Eli's name, shouted in a frenzy unlike anything ever witnessed. A stern old man, rarely one to show feeling, wiped his glasses with trembling hands and murmured, "This is real music, life itself given voice through the piano." The mother in the back row collapsed into her seat, hands covering her face, but in her tears was the purest pride. Tonight, before hundreds of witnesses, Eli Carter had turned pain into power, and the complex music he unleashed not only silenced every doubt, but planted in every heart the belief that miracles can rise from willpower and the desire to live. The applause had not yet faded when the grand doors at the back of the hall burst open, and a flood of flashing lights poured in like a blinding storm. The reporters who had been waiting outside now rushed in, cameras raised high, shutters clicking non-stop, drowning out the final echoes of music still lingering. Every frame captured the small face of Eli Carter at the piano, his dark glasses reflecting flickering lights, his hands still resting on the keys as if unwilling to let go. They pushed forward, calling his name, bombarding him with questions, trying to capture words at the peak of his rising brilliance. Eli didn't respond. He only smiled soft, a quiet, steady smile, letting the flashes hit him without flinching. As the cameras continued to fire, heated murmurs broke out across the hall. A group seated near the center began arguing, their doubtful voices threading through the noise. A calm-looking middle-aged man suddenly muttered with suspicion, "Was this staged?" Everything was too perfect. His words struck like a spark to dry grass, immediately igniting conflicting reaction. The man next to him frowned and replied, "Staged? The boy improvised right in front of us. No one can fake that kind of truth." But another chimed in, harsher still, "Then why this concert at this moment? Why were the press already in place like they knew what was coming?" The atmosphere in the hall stirred again, not with cheers this time, but with rising debate. Some quickly defended Eli, insisting that his music spoke for itself and needed no additions. One man stood up, raising his hand and speaking loudly over the doubt. "Music doesn't lie. We heard it with our own ears, felt it with our hearts. What more proof do we need?" Still, dissenting voices lingered, claiming the performance was too flawless, questioning how a child with no formal training could reach such heights. Each opinion layered over the neck, turning the hall into a sea of clashing sound. Marcia Carter sat silently in the back row, her eyes fixed on her son, still motionless at the piano. She heard every skeptical word, every defense, and her heart ached. She understood how hard it was for people to accept that genius could come from a place they never imagined. Harder still, when that genius lived in darkness and was the son of a single mother. But instead of stepping into the argument, she smiled, eyes shimmering. She believed Eli didn't need to explain himself because what he had just done had already gone beyond the reach of language and debate. Eli gently lifted his head, his lips moving slightly as if he could hear every wave of sound clashing around him. He said nothing, but his fingers lightly brushed across the piano key, producing a brief string of notes, soft yet resonant, like a whisper. That sound reached the ears of those closest to the stage, stopping them in their tracks, and it quickly spread silence throughout the room. The arguments hadn't fully ended, but the unexpected appearance of that melody felt like a reminder that music doesn't need to justify itself. It exists by its own strength. In that rare stillness, a few photographers lowered their cameras, exchanging bewildered glances. One of them whispered, "We just witnessed a moment money can't buy. That boy doesn't need a script." And immediately, the flashes began again, not just to capture an image, but to preserve proof of a truth shaking the musical world. From this moment on, Eli Carter was no longer a boy dismissed, but a symbol forcing everyone to reconsider themselves. Amid the divided murmurs, the group of police officers who had mocked Eli earlier suddenly became the focus of attention. Eyes from the audience turned toward them, many shaking their heads, whispers rising, silent accusations heavy enough to charge the air. A man near the aisle stood abruptly, pointing toward the security row and shouted, "You laughed at him, made him a spectacle. And now you think you still deserve to stand here?" Voices of agreement echoed around the hall, leaving the men in blue visibly uneasy. They tried to maintain stern expressions, but their eyes flickered with discomfort. Then, one by one, they lowered their heads and quietly exited the hall, each step heavy as if dragging stones. The back doors closed behind them, leaving a hollow silence, a wordless confession. Their retreat only heightened the tension, for everyone knew the last veil of justification had fallen. The audience sat still for a few seconds, then collectively shifted their gaze to Victor Stein, who remained the central figure of all the outrage. He sat frozen, hands resting on his knees, the grandeur of a maestro gone. His face had gone pale. His lips moved as if searching for a defense he could no longer summon. More than anyone, Victor understood that any excuse now would only shrink him further. The entire hall was waiting, not to hear more lies, but to witness his silence as the clearest proof that every accusation was true. A young student sitting in the top row leaned toward his friend and whispered, just loud enough for many to hear. Even he doesn't dare deny it. That sentence spread quickly like a spark, prompting several audience members to nod slightly, lips pressed tight, eyes sharp. They no longer looked at Victor with reverence, but with the gaze of judgment. In the past, his reputation had served as a shield, making anyone think twice before speaking, but now that very reputation had become evidence against him because Victor's silence meant admission. Marcia Carter still stood at the back of the hall, her eyes calm though her heart churned like a storm. She had once feared Victor so much she couldn't face him, but now she saw clearly that he was no towering wall at all. In front of her, Victor was nothing more than a small man, crushed by the weight of truth. Eli sat at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys, his face peaceful. He didn't need to speak because Victor's silence was the answer. In that moment, the vast concert hall felt like an invisible courtroom where everyone present was a witness. The music had been played, the truth laid bare, and now justice appeared in the simplest form. Victor Stein sat in silence, head bowed, and that silence erased every ounce of glory he had ever built, leaving behind only a shattered image in the eyes of all. As the concert hall gradually quieted, the noise outside remained loud with reporters refusing to leave. Victor Stein quietly stepped off the stage. He didn't walk away immediately, but chose the narrow path leading backstage, where the lights were no longer blinding and the judgmental eyes of the audience could not reach. There, Eli and Marcia Carter were seated, resting after the storm had passed. The boy placed his small hands on his lap, silent as if listening to the final echoes, still resonating in his heart. Marcia sat beside him, her hand clasping his thin fingers, her eyes heavy but glowing with pride. In that moment, Victor's tall figure appeared. He stood still for a while, as if unable to find words to begin, then finally bowed his head low, his voice dropping, hoarse with emotion and shame. I was wrong. That confession dropped into the still air like a stone cast onto a quiet lake, creating ripples that touched every soul present backstage. Eli turned his head toward the voice, but didn't answer, only raised his brows slightly as if to confirm whether that sound truly came from the man who once mocked him. Marcia looked straight at Victor, her eyes no longer avoiding his like before, and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake or waver, but was steady and unexpectedly firm. You weren't just wrong today. You've been wrong for years. The sentence was brief but weighty, not a loud accusation, but a silent, piercing indictment that forced Victor to bow his head even lower. Victor felt as though someone had clutched his chest, making every breath heavy. The image of the blind boy sitting at the piano with a calm smile haunted him, overlapping with memories of council meetings from years ago when he and others coldly erased the dreams of children deemed unfit. He clearly remembered Marcia's pleading eyes that day, eyes he had ignored in the name of preserving the Academy's pure reputation. Now, everything he had once defended had become evidence of cruelty. Marcia continued looking at him, not to relish seeing an arrogant man brought low, but to make him understand the cost of decisions once thought distant. My son once stood before your academy, waiting for a chance to prove himself, and you shut that door with a cold judgment. Today you say you were wrong, but do you know how many precious years you stole from a child? Her voice broke at the end, but her gaze remained firm like a blade slicing through Victor's arrogant shell. Eli sat still, his face showing nothing but calm. His hands gently opened, then touched the piano keys beside him, creating a soft sound, so faint it seemed meant only for himself. But that sound was a statement, a way of saying that what Victor had just confessed was too late to erase the past, yet not too late to begin learning how to listen. Marcia gently tightened her grip on her son's hand, a faint smile appearing on her lips. She knew that the truth had finally been forced into the open, and from this moment on, the wind had begun to shift. Victor bowed his head low, saying nothing in return. He knew any word spoken now would become a cheap excuse. He could only remain silent, letting that silence say it all. Then that the man once praised as a symbol of music now stood as nothing more than someone burdened by guilt. In the darkness backstage, the only light did not come from the overhead fixtures, but from Eli's small hands and Marcia's unwavering voice, a light that Victor could not hide from, forcing him to face himself. Eli stayed quiet for a long while after his mother spoke, then suddenly placed his hands on the piano. The backstage air seemed to freeze, all the noise outside fading away, leaving behind a fragile silence waiting to be broken. His small fingers began to glide gently, slowly, as if weaving a quiet confession. The music rose not loudly, not boastfully, but softly like a whisper, a gentle breath drawn from shadows and memory. It was not the thundering concerto that had just shaken the concert hall, but a short, simple melody filled with healing and forgiveness. Eli played for himself, for his mother, and for the man standing silently behind him, a man burdened with both pride and regret. Victor Stein instinctively lifted his head. The sound echoed through the wood, delicate like rain falling on stone steps. He felt his eyes sting, his throat tighten, and a feeling he had long forgotten stirred within him: humility. He had once sat before thousands of spectators, pounding his chest as a symbol of the arts, but now, just a few notes from a child made him feel strangely small. Eli's trembling fingers, seemingly fragile, were awakening in him the memory of a life he had left behind, a memory of a young man who once loved music with all his heart, before power and status turned that love into domination. The music stopped suddenly, brief but echoing endlessly in Victor's mind. Eli remained upright, saying nothing, as if he knew everything that needed to be said had already been carried in that melody. Marcia glanced at Victor, her eyes no longer angry, only expectant. Victor turned away, his shoulders trembling slightly, his vision blurred by unshed tears. He wanted to speak, to ask for forgiveness, but every word caught in his chest, stuck behind the weight of what had passed. At last, he let out a long breath. His hands clenched, then dropped, and all he could do was bow his head low. Victor's footsteps echoed heavily as he turned away, each step on the wooden floor sounding like the knock of uncertainty. He walked without looking back, afraid the clear gaze of the boy might bring him to his knees. His figure receded, tall but hunched, carrying the heavy weight of inner conflict. He left in silence, taking with him the sting awakened by music, the ache of someone who had seen the truth, but wasn't ready to face it. In the dim hallway, Victor's shadow stretched out, wavering, then dissolved into emptiness, leaving behind the blind boy still seated at the piano, hand resting gently on the keys, and the mother who watched quietly, knowing a new chapter had begun, not only for her son, but for the man who had just walked out with a heart still unraveling. In the days following the historic performance, the media began digging into the secrets behind the prestigious music academy that had once rejected Eli Carter. Major newspapers published transcripts from the admissions board, highlighting a chilling note scribbled beside his file: physically and socially unfit. That phrase dominated front pages, sparking a storm of outrage. Journalists tracked down former board members, interviewed alumni, and pieced together the full picture. They confirmed the academy had long applied vague criteria to eliminate many talented applicants for simply being different, including those with disabilities or from less privileged backgrounds. These revelations hit like a storm, igniting a nationwide uproar. On live television, journalists, scholars, artists, and even politicians engaged in heated debates about racism and access for people with disabilities in the arts. Many voiced anger that the Academy's gates had long been open only to the privileged few, turning art into the private property of an elite class. They condemned the injustice, insisting Eli's performance was irrefutable proof of a broken system. A few conservative voices tried to defend the Academy's strict standards as necessary for quality, but those arguments were swiftly rejected by public backlash. On social media, millions of comments poured in. Videos of Eli's performance were shared everywhere, accompanied by captions exposing the Academy's blindness. People created infographics comparing Eli's triumphant concert debut with the cold rejection he once received, painting a stark contrast. Phrases like equal opportunity, music sees no color, and light from darkness became widely shared slogans. The debate spilled over into schools, cafes, and offices, where people discussed the story with passion. Students from other conservatories organized forums questioning the true value of traditional standards. Arts associations issued statements urging a reassessment of admission practices, and numerous human rights organizations joined in, stressing that Eli's rejection was not just a moral failure, but a violation of basic human rights. Some lawmakers spoke in Parliament, demanding a full investigation. Amid the surging wave of public discourse, Eli's image became a symbol. People saw the blind boy sitting at the piano in his small apartment, where reporters gathered, and though he stayed away from the noise, each time his fingers touched the key, videos were recorded and quickly spread. Listeners didn't just hear music, they heard a voice of resistance against deeply rooted prejudice. And it was this very debate, sometimes heated to the point of division, pushed the story further, forcing everyone to confront one question: can talent be hidden simply because of skin color or blindness, or was art created to erase all boundary? No official statement was needed because the answer echoed clearly in every note Eli played, and in the growing wave of public pressure demanding society take a hard look at itself. The media exploded after the concert, and images of Eli Carter at the piano under glowing lights filled newspapers and social media. But what struck people the most wasn't just the music he created, it was the truth exposed. The Academy had rejected him for nothing more than his blindness. Headlines read, "A genius rejected. Music doesn't need eyes to shine," and op-eds poured in questioning the accountability of those once in power. Amid the storm of debate, many young artists raised their voices, openly expressing their anger over the injustice Eli had faced. One rising violinist posted a video of herself holding her instrument, saying bluntly, "If a child like Eli has no place in the Academy, then the fault isn't his. It lies with those who built walls of exclusion." The video was shared millions of times, becoming a rallying cry for young artists. A well-known singer who had once been underestimated wrote on her page, "I know what it feels like to be dismissed, but I got a chance to rise." Eli didn't. He carved his own path through music, and that's the clearest proof that talent doesn't live in the eyes of judges, but in the heart of creators. Her words struck a chord, fueling a wave of public empathy. Not only young artists at home, but many international figures voiced admiration and outrage. A French composer invited Eli to perform in Paris, calling him a symbol of musical freedom. A group of young musicians in Japan held a street concert, raising signs with Eli's name and performing the piece he had played in the concert hall, as a gesture of cross-border solidarity. These weren't just acts of support, but unified statements against the prejudice that had silenced so many gifted voices. As more voices rose, the movement demanding justice for Eli grew stronger. Small protests began forming outside the gates of the Music Academy, starting with just a few dozen students holding banners, then spreading to hundreds, gathering and chanting for change. On forums, countless posts questioned fairness in the arts, calling for an end to discrimination against the vulnerable. Phrases like, "Music doesn't need eyes," "Equal chance for every talent," and "Eli is the light" became slogans shared widely across social media. Pressure on the Academy intensified daily, and many former students who had once stayed silent came forward to share their experiences of unfair treatment. An online petition was launched. Ed and the Days gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures in support of investigating the Academy's selection system. Major newspapers continued covering the story, publishing photos and statements from supporters, turning the case from one boy's story into a national issue. Amid the rising wave, Eli remained quietly at his piano in the small apartment, not letting himself be swept into the noise, but knowing his music had truly stirred many hearts. Marcia Carter saw the change clearly, how people who once turned away were now marching and speaking out. She understood that the movement had grown beyond defending her son. It was now clearing a path for many other children who might otherwise face doors slammed shut from the start. In every step, in every shouted slogan, she heard the echo of justice awakening, an echo born from the small hands once ridiculed, now turned into a symbol of belief and hope. After the story of Eli Carter's rejection by the Music Academy came to light, Victor Stein could no longer escape the consequences of his actions. His illustrious career quickly became overshadowed by scandal. The prestigious Music Academy, where Victor had been for many years, began to apply intense pressure on him. Public criticism escalated, and secret meetings were held to figure out how to handle the controversy. His past decisions were now exposed and became an unavoidable burden. In one of the meetings, the Academy's leadership demanded an explanation for his refusal of a talent like Eli, something he had never been forced to face before. Journalists and the public focused on him, and instead of being celebrated, he became the target of criticism, the man carrying the weight of his mistakes. The attention was no longer on his musical achievements, but on the errors and the coldness he had shown to the very children who had once yearned to learn from him. In the months that followed, Victor realized he was no longer the respected name in the music world. Instead of receiving performance invitations, he was met with cold indifference. Former colleagues who once admired him, those who had stood by him on major stages, no longer wanted to share the spotlight with him. They avoided him, no longer calling or sending congratulations for his small successes. Regular meetings turned into silent encounters, with no words of encouragement or praise, just coldness. Young artists, who had once sought him out to learn from him, now turned their backs. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had hurt young talents and shattered public trust. Victor could feel the change. The parties where he had once been the center of attention now became cold gatherings, where he silently stood on the sidelines. Old friends no longer greeted him as they once had, and the smiles at these meetings now seemed forced, lacking sincerity. He could hear the whispered conversations behind his back, the avoiding glances when he entered a room. A feeling of loneliness began to envelop him, and the fame he had carefully built now felt like an empty shell. Once a revered idol, a mentor to generations of artists, he was now nothing more than a faded shadow in a dark corner of society. Victor had once believed that his reputation was untouchable, but now he was forced to face the truth. Nothing is permanent, and he himself had shattered the very values he once pursued. His mistakes had not only hurt a child, but also eroded the trust of an entire generation. The most painful realization was that he couldn't change the past, that he had allowed fear, arrogance, and poor decisions to lead him into a dead end. He had failed to recognize that music was not just about personal success, but a tool for connection, helping people understand and love each other. Therefore, as his career crumbled, Victor felt he had lost not only his reputation, but himself as well. In addition to the professional failure, Victor had to face the distance growing between him and those he was once close to. A former friend, a famous artist who had once walked alongside him in conquering the heights of success, no longer kept in touch. They didn't directly condemn him, but their silence spoke louder than any words. Family members also began to look at him differently, no longer with admiration, but with pity. This feeling of loss not only hurt Victor, but also made him question the true value of the life he was living. All his successes, awards, and recognition now seemed meaningless because he had wiped them all away with his own misguided decisions. With all of this, Victor had no choice but to face his past and take a hard look at himself. The firm steps he once took in his music career were now replaced by quiet, regret-filled strides. But still, he knew that perhaps the realization of his mistakes was the first step toward starting over, to no longer live in the shadow of poor choices. Though the journey to redemption would be long, at least he had made the first steps. Steps he knew he would never be able to undo. After his career collapsed, Victor began to spiral into crisis. A sense of emptiness and confusion spread throughout his mind, preventing him from thinking clearly. Everything he had built over the long years, starting from a poor boy with nothing, now seemed to vanish in an instant. He sat alone in the empty room. No more grand concerts or bright stage lights. Only the heavy silence. Memories of his past, of the days when he was a poor, overlooked child, began to flood back. Victor remembered the mockery of his friends, the disdainful glances from the adults in his neighborhood when they looked at him. A child with no future, no opportunity. Those memories never left him, and now they felt like old whips, relentlessly striking his heart, keeping him trapped in the remorse. Victor realized throughout his life he had been running to escape the shadow of his past. He had used his success in music to prove to the world that he was valuable, that the poor boy he once was had risen to become a person of power. But he hadn't realized that in doing so, he had lost himself. He had lost the humility and compassion he once cherished. The heights he had reached, all the fame and admiration from the audience, no longer held any meaning when he realized that he had lost the core of art itself, that is, connection and understanding. In the process, he had become someone who no longer knew empathy, someone who only chased after what was deemed success while overlooking the true value. The regret grew larger in Victor's heart. Every night, he stayed awake, unable to sleep as images of Eli Carter kept appearing in his mind. The image of the blind boy, with his dark glasses and white cane, the boy he had once rejected, now became the epitome of resilience that he had never had. Eli not only had exceptional talent, but also a big heart, unbroken by the prejudice of society. And the more Victor thought about Eli, the more he felt small. The boy had overcome scorn and risen, while he, someone who had once had it all, now sat there facing himself in regret. This regret not only tortured Victor in his mind, but also began to affect his health. The sleepless nights, the restless thoughts, made him feel as if he was sinking into the darkness of his past, unable to find a way out. He realized that throughout his life, he had spent too much time running from things that could not be changed, instead of confronting them and learning from his mistakes. The rejections of Eli, the moments he overlooked talents simply because he didn't see them clearly, had now become wounds that could never heal. Victor began to look back at what he had missed. He remembered the times he sat in the student's chair, when he had neglected friends, family, and loved ones just to pursue the hollow fame. He recalled the mistakes he made in his career, decisions he thought were right at the time but had only ruined relationships and driven him further from the true values of life. And then, the regret continued to grow inside him, like a relentless wave attacking him, making it impossible for him to live peacefully in the final years of his life. But it was this very regret that became essential for Victor to recognize himself. It was the first step in learning how to atone, to rediscover the humility and compassion he had lost. The feeling of guilt, the torment, were things that could never be erased, but they also became the driving force for him to make amends for his mistakes. He knew that looking back at the past and acknowledging his wrongs wasn't easy, but it was a necessary step to begin anew, to no longer live in the shadow of past wrong decisions. And from that point, Victor's regret, no matter how painful, became the starting point of a journey toward redemption, so he could live a more meaningful life, for the children, for music, and for himself. As Victor Stein sat alone in the empty room, his thoughts drifted back to his childhood, a time when he was a poor boy struggling through life's hardships. The image of a child full of desire and dreams, yet despised by society and those around him, clearly appeared in his mind. These memories came like crashing waves, impossible to forget. He distinctly remembered the words of his old teacher, the one who once stood at the podium, looking down at the poor student, and uttered a cruel, thoughtless sentence: "You will never achieve anything because you're not worthy of music." Those words pierced the young Victor's heart, and from that moment, a burning hatred sparked within him. Rather than give up, he used that disdain as motivation to rise above, to prove that people like him could stand tall and succeed. But now, sitting in the darkness of his failures and regret, Victor realized that what he had done to Eli was the same thing his old teacher had done to him. He had repeated the cruelty he once suffered. This realization hit Victor like a powerful shock, leaving him unable to continue hiding from himself. He had spent his life running from the painful memories of his youth, but now they not only returned, but forced him to face them. Victor understood that the contempt he had received from his teacher had become a part of him, and it had inadvertently shaped the decisions he made regarding Eli. The rejection of Eli was not just an action of a person lacking empathy. It was a reenactment of what he had gone through, of a teacher who undervalued his worth as a child. Although he had overcome it back then, he now saw that he had become the one causing pain to someone else. And the cruelty he had experienced was the driving force behind continuing to harm others without even realizing it. Victor's heart ached. He had once thought he was protecting the academy, upholding artistic standards. He believed that rejecting Eli was a wise decision, a choice to preserve artistic values. But now, all those thoughts crumbled. He realized he had been too focused on personal success, too obsessed with affirming his own worth, and had forgotten the true values. The cruelty he had faced in the past wasn't just the contempt of his teacher, but also the ruthlessness he had shown to other talents, people he thought he had the right to reject. And this had destroyed him, destroyed the most beautiful things in life that he had once pursued. This realization, though painful, was necessary for Victor to change. He couldn't go back and correct his mistakes, but at least he could start with small steps, facing his past, and acknowledging that no one has the right to decide someone else's fate, especially when that person possesses true talent and passion. The words of his old teacher were not just a wound, but a valuable lesson about pride and cruelty. Victor had learned that sometimes, what we see in others is simply the shadow of ourselves. And now, he no longer ran from that shadow but faced it, learning to forgive himself and those around him. Victor's story is not just a journey to reclaim self-worth, but also a quest for truth in what seemed to be unchangeable. He had once let others' contempt push him further, but now, he understood that only love and empathy could truly help someone rise, not disdain or rejection. In this very realization, Victor not only began to change himself, but also created an opportunity for disabled children, like Eli, to step into the light and find their own voices. The lingering torment continued to tear at Victor Stein, like a storm that ravaged all the peace he once had. The days after being harshly criticized left everything around him in ruins. In the quiet of the room, he couldn't escape the memory of Eli Carter and the mistakes he had made. Every time he thought of the blind boy, he felt a painful knot in his chest, guilt and shame consuming him. The rejections, the cold look he had given Elle, were like daggers to his heart. When recalling how he never gave Eli a chance, anger and regret piled up. Victor knew he had hurt a person simply because of his arrogance, lack of empathy, and the prejudices that were deeply embedded within him. This feeling was inescapable, like a ghost always haunting him, preventing him from living peacefully. Each night, as exhaustion sets in, Victor finds himself unable to sleep peacefully. The images of Eli, the notes he played, and the tears in his eyes keep flashing vividly in front of him. The regret in Victor grows ever larger, not because of the loss of his fame or career, but because he realizes he wronged the one person he should have helped. He remembers the days when he was a poor boy, looked down upon by society, and now he has become the one who is undeserving, the one who overlooked another's talent and passion. These thoughts are like waves that never cease. Each time they rise, Victor feels himself sinking, standing at the edge of a chasm he cannot return from. Victor had once thought he could escape guilt by continuing to live in the glow of his career, but now he understands that the truth cannot be hidden. The harm he caused cannot be erased by successes, only rectified by real action. He has faced himself and realized that forgiveness does not come through empty words but through deeds. The anguish tearing at his heart is the motivation for him to seek a path to redemption, the only way he can start again. He cannot change the past, but he can change the future. That is the only thing Victor can do now, to repair the mistakes he has made. Victor's decision is not easy. He knows that nothing can compensate for the pain he caused Eli and others, but he cannot continue living without doing something. He cannot just stand by when opportunities for redemption still exist. He begins to seek ways to atone, starting with the smallest actions. Victor personally reaches out to charities and scholarship funds for disabled children to help those like Eli, giving them a chance to learn music and develop their talents that they could never access without help. He begins participating in community meetings, speaking about his transformation, not just to seek forgiveness, but to emphasize that everyone has the opportunity to right their wrongs if they truly wish to change. Victor does not stop there. He decides to become a teacher, a mentor for underprivileged children, inspiring them to dream and pursue their passion, just as he once did. Gradually, he is remembered not only for the success and fame he once had, but also for his actions to make amends, for his tireless dedication to children who have never been properly recognized. He becomes a symbol, not of greatness, but of humility, forgiveness, and love. Looking back on the long road he has traveled, Victor knows there are still many mistakes to correct, but at least he has begun the journey of atonement. It is a journey without an end, but he no longer fears, for he understands that regret is not the end, but the first step to starting anew. One morning, as sunlight quietly filtered through the old living room window, Marcia Carter received a large envelope bearing the clear logo of the prestigious music academy that had once rejected Eli. As she opened the letter, she could hardly believe her eyes. It was an official invitation from the academy, offering Eli admission as a special student. Line by line, the formal and respectful tone of the letter stunned her. "Our academy is honored to invite Eli Carter to join and study at our institution. To develop his talent in a professional academic and artistic environment." Marcia reread it several times, unable to believe what she was seeing. After everything that had happened, the cruel rejection was now replaced by an opportunity she once thought would never come. This letter was not just an offer of admission, but a recognition, an acknowledgement of Eli's talent. It was also an opportunity Marcia couldn't ignore. Yet inside her, mixed emotions began to rise. Had things really changed? Marcia looked at Eli, her eyes filled with concern, not about success or fame, but about a single question: should we believe it this time? She had taught Eli never to place his hopes in empty promises, that the world doesn't always treat people fairly, but in this moment, she didn't know what to believe. It was a big opportunity, but one that carried risks she couldn't ignore. Eli sat next to her, hands resting on the piano, his face as calm as always, the dark eyes behind his glasses showing no visible emotion. He listened to his mother but didn't reply immediately. The two sat in silence for a while, needing no more words, because Eli already understood what his mother was feeling. She was torn, not because she didn't want her son to have a chance, but because she was afraid of getting hurt again. The 12-year-old slowly turned toward his mother, his lips curving into a slight but confident smile. "Mom, I've always believed in music. If they invited me because of talent, there's no reason not to trust this opportunity. And if they invited me out of guilt, then I don't need to prove anything to them." Marcia looked at her son, and a surprising sense of relief rose within her. Eli wasn't anxious, wasn't hesitant, and more than anything, he believed in himself. He hadn't allowed himself to be forgotten or locked behind the prejudice and doors that had once slammed shut in front of him. What mattered wasn't the academy or anyone else. It was him and his unshakable belief in his own ability. In that moment, Marcia realized that no matter the Academy's reasons for sending the letter, for Eli, music was the path, and he would always follow it. Marcia held the letter in her hand, her gaze cautious but no longer filled with doubt. "Maybe this time will be different," she thought. And maybe Eli would be the one to change the world's perception of talent, fairness, and the opportunities we find in the strongest waves of life. She gently folded the letter, not to reject, but to prepare for a new step forward. A door had opened, and this time, she would not stop Eli from walking through it. As Marcia finished reading the invitation, emotions surged inside her, but Eli just quietly listened without responding right away. He looked out the window, the dark eyes behind his glasses reflecting a faint touch of sunlight. After a long silence, Eli finally spoke, his voice calm and steady like the thoughts forming in his heart. "I need music, not titles." The words were not dramatic, but carried invisible weight, as if he was ready to walk away from the opportunities society had laid out, just to live by the call of his own heart. It wasn't fame or recognition that would make him great, but the music itself, the melodies born from deep within his soul, that mattered most. That one sentence made Marcia look at her son, and this time, her eyes no longer held doubt. She realized that no matter which path Eli chose, he already had the strength to face anything. For him, music was not a tool to climb the social ladder, but a way of life, the flame he had found and held onto in the darkness. The stumbles of the past, the rejections and cruelty, could never take away his dream. She understood now that whatever happened, Eli would always be himself, always hold on to his belief in music as something essential to his life. Meanwhile, Eli's story had become more than the pain of one individual. It had become a source of inspiration for many in the community. Stories of Eli, of his resilience against fate, of how music gave hope to children with disabilities or those in vulnerable situations, quickly spread across community groups, especially among the Black community. Artists and social activists began organizing benefit concerts for Eli, with the goal of creating a scholarship fund to help underprivileged and disabled children gain access to music. This wasn't just a music event, but a movement, a call for justice in society, so no one would be excluded for being different, so no one would be rejected just because of their limitations. For the first time in his life, Eli felt the powerful support of the community. Black artists, those who had once struggled to find a place in the music industry, organized concerts not just for one individual, but for all the children who shared dreams like Eli's. The first fundraising concert was held in a grand theater where talented performers, regardless of gender, race, or disability, came together to perform. Each song, each piece played was a powerful declaration that music belongs to everyone, without exception. Photos of Eli sitting at the piano beside well-known artists were widely shared across media platforms. The calls for the scholarship fund were echoed not only by musicians but also by scholars and leaders of social movements. Television interviews made it impossible for viewers to ignore the injustice faced by Eli and other vulnerable children. The Black community stood united, affirming that talent is not defined by circumstances or skin color, and they would not allow anyone to be left behind because of things beyond their control. That fundraising concert was more than just a night of music. It was a major turning point. It became a social movement, a powerful statement that all children, regardless of background or origin, deserve the right to learn and develop their talents. The Eli Carter Scholarship Fund was founded soon after, becoming a source of hope for many children in the community, helping them step into the world of music without the fear of rejection due to their situation. And with every child awarded a scholarship, Eli's story continued to live on, spreading the belief that music can change lives. As the applause began to fade after Eli's emotional performance, a figure unexpectedly appeared at the edge of the stage. Victor Stein, once at the peak of the music world, now quietly stepped into the dim light. The audience sat in silence, eyes filled with surprise and confusion, fixed on him. Victor's aged eyes revealed exhaustion, but there was something else in his gaze: regret, an awareness of past mistakes he could no longer hide. He stood still for a moment, then slowly walked toward the waiting piano. The hall fell completely silent. No one dared to breathe, and only the sound of Victor's footsteps echoed through the vast space. As he neared the piano, he paused, his eyes still following Eli, who had just risen from his own performance. At that moment, Eli, though somewhat surprised, showed no fear or discomfort. He had heard of Victor many times in the past, but now his presence carried no air of dominance or control. It was the appearance of someone who had come to terms with his mistakes, and Eli could feel it in Victor's gaze. After a long silence, Victor finally spoke, his voice rough and low. "Eli, if you don't mind, may I accompany you in your next piece?" It wasn't a request, it was an invitation, an acknowledgement. The entire hall held its breath, waiting for Eli's response. Eli didn't answer right away. He simply smiled, a calm, quiet smile, as if the decision had already been made. He gave a small nod, then turned back toward the piano. To Eli, music was about connection, not division, and this time, He chose to share that rhythm with Victor, not for revenge, but to allow regret to take the next step in its journey. Victor quietly took a seat at the piano, his hands gently resting on the keys. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Their former confrontation no longer felt like a conflict, but a reconciliation. Victor began to follow Eli's melody, not to assert himself, but to listen, to become part of what the boy was playing. Their music blended, creating a performance that wasn't perfect, but full of emotion and sincerity. Every note they played was not just a collaboration between two musicians, but a dialogue between past and present, between regret and forgiveness. At first, the audience was skeptical, but the moment the notes began to play, all doubts disappeared. No one in the hall thought about the past, about mistakes. Only the music remained, the music of healing. Every note Victor played, every melody Eli performed, felt like an apology, a mutual respect. When the piece ended, the applause didn't stop. This time, it wasn't just for the perfection of the music, but for the emotion it carried. No one stood up immediately. Everyone seemed caught in a deeply emotional moment. Eli stood, his hands resting gently on the key, looking toward Victor. He didn't need words of thanks, only a look of understanding. Victor met his eyes, filled with gratitude and remorse, smiled, then bowed sincerely. To him, this was not just a moment of forgiveness, but of regret and redemption. And from that moment on, they were no longer adversaries, but two people sharing a musical journey, carrying a belief in the power of change. When Victor began to play, murmurs filled the hall, the surprise hanging in the air. Curious and doubtful glances passed quickly, as if everyone was waiting for a clear signal from Eli, the blind boy the world had once rejected. Soft whispers rose. Someone even muttered, "What will he do next? Will it be harmony or disaster?" But all skepticism faded the instant Eli's fingers touched the keys. The first notes rang out, soft and fluid, without hesitation, as if this blind boy had found the perfect connection with the sound flowing from his own hand. The audience fell silent. No one dared to breathe, because they all sensed this was no ordinary musical performance. It was a moment of harmony, a deep confrontation between past and present. Victor's and Eli's fingers moved across the keys together, once from two different worlds, now flowing like two inseparable waves. They weren't playing to win, but to share something deep from within. Each note, each sound seemed to break free from pain and regret, but also offered release, forgiveness, and unity between two generations. Those sounds were not just melody, but a bridge of time, of experiences and lessons both Victor and Eli had learned. In front of them was an audience unable to hide their emotion. The people in the hall felt that this was not just a performance, but a significant event. This was a moment when music was no longer just an art form, but a rebirth of humanity, of forgiveness, of the courage to face one's mistakes. When the final note was played, a stillness fell over the space, as if to affirm that everything that needed to be said had already been expressed through each note. The audience could no longer hold back, and a wave of applause erupted like thunder. It wasn't just any applause, but one filled with sincerity, respect, and admiration. People stood up, not because of a flawless performance, but because they had witnessed an emotional musical journey. They saw two generations, two people with completely different backgrounds and histories, now sharing the same rhythm. Eli, once a forgotten child, had risen and proven that music could transcend all prejudice. Victor, once a rigid and prideful teacher, had found humility and learned to open his heart to forgiveness and change. In that moment, no one remembered the mistakes of the past. No one searched for divisions between those who once stood on opposite sides. All that remained was music, music of unity and mutual understanding. Two fates, two individuals, were now not just sharing the same stage, but were part of a single composition that all of us could feel. Within those sounds, we saw that people could change, could rise after failure, and turn something wrong into part of something greater. The applause continued, growing louder, like a reminder that forgiveness, understanding, and perseverance could overcome all obstacles. They stood not just to celebrate the two musicians, but to honor themselves for becoming part of this journey, for witnessing a moment when music was no longer just an art, but a part of life, a guiding light for all of us. After everything that had happened, Victor Stein could no longer live in silence. Sitting alone in the dark room, he stared out the window, watching the dry leaves fall, his heart heavy. The image of Eli, the blind boy full of strength and talent, haunted his mind. That rejection long ago had closed the door on Eli's dream. And now, the ongoing criticism from the public made Victor realize he could no longer keep avoiding the truth. It was time to face himself, to take responsibility for the irreversible mistakes he had made. With a heart full of regret, Victor decided to publicly apologize, not only to Eli, but to all those who had suffered from the injustice he had caused. The press conference took place in a tense atmosphere. crowded with reporters and flashing cameras. Victor stepped up to the podium, his face aged, hair silver, and eyes no longer filled with pride, but with the weight of someone who had come to understand his own faults. When he spoke, there was no arrogance or superiority, only a deep, acknowledging voice. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I closed the door on a talent, on a dream, because of my own prejudice. Today I stand before you not to justify myself, but to admit that I was wrong and want to make it right." His apology rang out in silence. No one interrupted. Only quiet gazes followed him, a silence of empathy and recognition. Victor didn't stop at an apology. He knew that admitting fault wasn't enough. He had to act to repair the harm he had caused. After the press conference, he announced the creation of a scholarship fund specifically for children with disabilities, hoping to support talented kids who lacked the resources to grow. The fund was not just about providing access to music education, but also about his commitment to owning his past mistakes. Victor devoted all his performance earnings and personal savings to open up a path for underprivileged and disabled children, kids who may have never believed music could be part of their lives. People might have doubted his motives, but Victor's actions showed that he wasn't apologizing because of public pressure, but because he truly wanted to do something meaningful, to repay what he had once taken away. Every time he stepped on stage, every concert he performed to raise funds, he felt a sense of relief knowing those children would no longer be rejected just because they weren't perfect in someone else's eyes. Victor understood that regaining respect doesn't come from reputation alone, but from real deeds, from making amends for past wrong. The scholarship fund was quickly embraced by the community, and the first children to receive scholarships from Victor were not only talented, but also carried with them new dreams and hopes. The tears in the eyes of parents watching their children enter a music classroom for the first time changed everything. It wasn't just Eli. Every child given the chance to study music stood as proof of change, of a journey filled with regret and effort. And since the scholarship was established, every time Victor saw blind, deaf, or otherwise disabled children walk into a classroom, he felt something within himself being healed, because he knew it was a worthy redemption. Although the scholarship could not erase all the mistakes of the past, it was a vital part of Victor's path to redemption. He chose to face the truth, and through concrete actions, he was working not only to change himself, but to help those he had once overlooked. Because of this, Victor not only salvaged his own conscience, but also brought hope and opportunity to children who otherwise had none. His story, once again, became proof of the power of awareness and the ability to start over. After Victor's remorseful admission, the room remained silent, as if time had paused, with every eye fixed on Eli, waiting for his reaction. The 12-year-old boy, once rejected and wounded, now stood in the spotlight of forgiveness and welcome. He said nothing, only bowed his head slightly, his hands resting on the piano keys, and then a warm, gentle melody began to rise. The notes weren't a form of resistance, but of empathy. The music spoke in response to it all, as if Eli didn't need to say anything. He let the music speak for his heart. Those melodies were not just an acknowledgement, but an invitation, a way for Eli to welcome Victor onto a shared path, where both could find harmony. The first notes whispered softly, unhurried, drifting through the air, then quickly swelled into stronger, more emotional tones, like waves washing away the pain. Eli's playing wasn't overly complex, yet it was strangely captivating, each note carrying the message that forgiveness and compassion can bring healing. The hall seemed to hold its breath, every gaze fixed on his fingers, not just because of his talent, but because of the heart of a child who was willing to share what he had with the world. The audience, once full of criticism and mockery, now sat in complete silence. They quietly watched Eli, each note tightening the grip on their hearts. No one could deny the intensity in every sound. No one could ignore the emotion Eli poured into every keystroke. Some couldn't hold back their tears, which rolled silently down their cheeks. And they understood that in that moment, what they were hearing was not just music. It was a story of forgiveness, of overcoming prejudice, and of the triumph of the heart. Victor sat there, eyes fixed on Eli's every movement, his heart seemingly stopped. He couldn't believe he was witnessing this moment, when a boy he once deemed unworthy was now teaching him a lesson in empathy. Every note Eli played felt like a reminder of past mistakes, and more than that, an affirmation that music could bring healing, not only for the listener, but also for the one who played. The audience began to quietly shed tears, and some could no longer hold back, rising to their feet and applauding. Gradually, the applause spread, strong and sincere. Those who once doubted, those who condemned Eli and Victor, were now standing, not to support one individual, but to support something greater: humanity, forgiveness, and hope. Their transformation did not come from a performance alone, but from the melodies Eli had just created, from a change deep within the soul of each person. The applause didn't stop. It grew louder and more powerful, like waves washing over the room. The audience felt something bigger than music. They realized that the tears, the clapping, were all expressions of empathy, understanding, and the acknowledgement of what music can truly offer. The entire auditorium rose in unison, clapping together, and as the space filled with that sound, Eli lifted his head and smiled gently. He didn't need words or praise, because through his music, Eli had found harmony, a healing for the wounds of the past. That moment was not just the end of a concert. It was the beginning of a new story, one of forgiveness, of overcoming oneself, of turning each piece of music into a firmer step on a long journey ahead. And when the final applause faded, each person was left with a feeling they couldn't quite describe, a feeling brought on by the music itself, filled with hope and belief in what lies ahead. Immediately after Victor Stein publicly acknowledged his mistakes and established the Scholarship Fund for Children with Disabilities, the music foundation he and the community supported quickly became active and grew rapidly. Old pianos, violins, and guitars were donated and brought into art centers for underprivileged and disabled children. The fund's success came not only from financial contributions, but from the dedication and passion of artists, teachers, and the community. Free classes were opened in impoverished areas where children had never had the chance to experience music. Deaf, blind, and physically disabled children all had the opportunity to learn instruments, feel rhythm, and find joy in music. Volunteer teachers and artists came from everywhere, teaching the children not just basic music technique, but also confidence, perseverance, and belief in themselves. The story of the Scholarship Fund quickly spread, not only among artists, but throughout social community. The fund was seen as a symbol of change, clear proof that disadvantaged children could rise above their circumstances to become true artists. Children who had once been overlooked and rejected by society could now stand tall, perform on stage, and tell their stories through music. The Scholarship Fund not only provided access to instruments but also opened the door to a brighter future for children who had never dared to dream. By learning and playing music, these children didn't just gain a skill, they learned to believe in themselves, knowing that no matter where they started, they could still change their lives. Alongside the success of the Scholarship Fund, Eli Carter became a symbol of inspiration for millions. He was not only a talented musician, but also a model of resilience and courage. Eli proved that while life may be hard and full of injustice, if we don't give up and stay true to our passion, eventually a path will open. He became a source of strength for many disabled children in the community, who found in his story the courage to overcome prejudice and the challenges of life. Eli's story was incorporated into educational programs, with social organizations using it as an example of perseverance and the power of belief. His quote, "I need music, not title," became a slogan in many community development programs, encouraging young people, especially those with disabilities, to never give up on their dream. Seminars and discussions on the rights of people with disabilities and on access to education and talent development were regularly held, drawing inspiration from Eli. In the following years, Eli not only appeared at major concerts, but also participated in many community music projects, joining other renowned artists in bringing music to underprivileged children with disabilities. He worked alongside artists and charitable organizations to build music centers in impoverished areas where children could attend free music lessons. He also organized fundraising concerts, not only to support the Scholarship Fund, but to spread a message of inclusion and fairness in music. Eli became a familiar face in the international community, not just as an artist, but as a source of inspiration. Every time he stepped on stage, it wasn't only to play music, but to remind everyone of the importance of never giving up and never letting society dismiss one's dream. He continued to live and play music, not for recognition or fame, but out of genuine passion for music, because he understood that music could transform not only his own life, but also the world. The Scholarship Fund remained active, helping thousands of children with disabilities gain access to music. Classes continued to open, teaching children not just musical skills, but also lessons about life, confidence, and the belief that nothing is impossible. And from Eli's story, a new legacy was built, one not just of music, but of change, hope, and resilience, a legacy that would live on in the children whose lives the fund had touched and transformed. Victor Stein, after all the ups and downs of his career, finally let go of the spotlight he had treasured for so many years. Though once a celebrated artist with a brilliant and respected career, he came to understand that what had brought him to that position was not only talent, but also arrogance and the willingness to sacrifice spiritual values for success. That past no longer held meaning for him. The grand concerts, the applause from audiences, now felt empty. Instead, he chose a different path, one without stage lights or praise, filled with quiet dedication to the community, especially to children with disability. Letting go of personal gain, Victor embraced a simpler life, devoting all his energy to supporting and teaching young students. Children once cast aside by society because of their physical limitations. He no longer needed recognition. He found joy in helping and creating opportunities for children who, like him, had once been underestimated. This process was not easy for Victor. Letting go of a world he had lived in his entire life was a turning point. But gradually, he realized that being a teacher, bringing music to those who had never had the opportunity, gave him a sense of comfort and peace that fame had never provided. The music lessons with the children, the quiet afternoons he spent beside an old piano, just him and the underprivileged kids, were the only moments he truly felt alive. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, only to do his job well, to pass on inspiration and passion to the children. In those moments, Victor felt that he was doing the right thing, something no title or glory could ever bring. Alongside Victor's journey, Eli Carter was also becoming a new symbol. From a blind boy once rejected by the academy, Eli had shown the world that difference is not weakness, but a powerful strength. Every concert, every performance he took part in was not just a musical event, but a fight for the right to be seen and respected. Eli didn't just play music, he lived in it, and his music brought light not only to himself, but to others. Children with disabilities and those in poverty, the ones labeled as unfit for this world, looked to Eli and found in his story the strength to pursue their own dreams. He became an inspiration not only within the blind and deaf communities but also throughout the broader music world. As each time he played, it served as a reminder that talent is never limited by disability or background. The story of Eli and Victor, though from two different positions, blended together like a complete piece of music. Eli was not just a musician, but a symbol of resilience, a model of courage in the face of hardship and prejudice. Victor, through his own journey, became a symbol of remorse, of realizing his mistakes and finding a way to make things right. Together, they were seen as symbols of change, not just because of their talent, but because of the shift in how they viewed themselves and the world around them. They not only transformed their own lives, but also brought about change in the community, opening a new path for disabled and disadvantaged children, giving them a chance to grow and live fully with their passion. From those moving events, Eli and Victor built a new legacy, not through medals or accolades, but through meaningful actions that helped others. They proved that people can change, can overcome past mistakes to build a better future. Their story is not just a lesson in music, but a lesson in perseverance, forgiveness, and the power to begin again. As society gradually recognizes the importance of creating opportunities for everyone, from disabled children to the marginalized, Eli and Victor will always stand as role models for the next generation, those brave enough to step out of the shadows and find the light in music and in themselves. 1 year after Eli Carter's story began making waves, the blind boy who was once underestimated now stood on one of the world's most prestigious music stages. The International Concert Hall, home to top-tier performers, now welcomed Eli as a star. His career was no longer judged by society's prejudice, but defined by his talent and his love for music. The image of him sitting at the piano with the stage lights casting a glow on his radiant face became a symbol of resilience and determination. He no longer needed to prove anything because the music said it all. That night, audiences from around the world came to hear Eli play, not just for his talent, but for the inspiring story he carried with him. As he played the first notes, the entire hall seemed to fall still. Each sound emerged gently, then gradually grew stronger, drawing listeners into an indescribable emotional journey. The melodies he played weren't just demonstrations of skill, acts of sharing, a piece of life, a belief in a future without limits. Each key struck sparked hope in the hearts of those listening. Eli didn't just perform music. He told a story of a journey, of rising above hardship. When the piece ended, the hall fell silent for a moment, before erupting into thunderous, unending applause. The audience clapped not only for an outstanding performance, but for the emotion Eli had poured into it. They rose to their feet, a gesture of respect not only for his talent, but for the courage and strength he had shown throughout his journey. The applause was not only for Eli, but for all the vulnerable children, for those cast aside by society. They stood for Eli, for his story, and for the belief every barrier life presents can be overcome. In that moment, Eli felt the true power of music, not because of the notes or melodies, but because it had transformed his life, and now it was transforming the world. He lifted his head, his dark eyes behind glasses unable to see, but he could feel the warmth of admiring gazes directed at him. Eli was no longer the blind boy once dismissed, but an honored artist, a symbol of resilience and compassion. Eli's story is not just a journey from darkness to light, but a lesson in forgiveness and transformation. From hesitant steps on a road full of challenges, he not only rose, but brought other hearts along with him. Eli proved that music is not only an art, but a means of healing, of opening doors that had once been slammed shut. Under the brilliant lights of the International Hall, Eli was not just an artist, but a messenger delivering a powerful truth. Every dream can come true, whether you're disabled or not. When the concert ended, the audience didn't just remember an outstanding performance. They remembered a blind boy who had overcome every obstacle to stand strong on one of the greatest stages in the music world. The story of Eli Carter ended on a high note, but it continued to echo, inspiring millions of others to dream, to pursue their passion, and to never let anything hold them back. Eli didn't just change his own life. He changed how the world views vulnerable children, showing them that anyone can shine if they have the faith and courage to try. When Eli Carter lifted his hands from the final note, the air in the concert hall seemed to freeze in absolute silence. Every eye was on him, not just for his musical talent, but for the story he had told through those very melodies. Victor Stein sat in the front row, his hand trembling as it struck the armrest, but he didn't stop. Applause erupted, loud and unrelenting. The audience stood, not just in admiration of musical perfection, but for what Eli's music had brought: transformation, recognition, and deep compassion. Victor's eyes welled with tears, unable to contain his emotions. Each clap was like a word of forgiveness, a word of thanks to the blind boy who had risen above ridicule and misjudgment to prove that talent doesn't need eyes to see the beauty of the world. Victor was no longer the proud man defined by past achievements. He was simply a quiet figure who had come to realize that some things matter more than fame and acknowledgement. Sitting in the concert hall, he could feel the shift within himself. In every round of applause, he no longer saw himself as Eli's former mentor, but as a student learning anew the value of life. Eli's story of change wasn't just a child's triumph over adversity, it was a lesson in humility and persistence. Victor couldn't help but regret the mistakes he had made, but now, he no longer dwelt on the past. Instead, he knew that even the smallest action, sitting silently, clapping, was a step in the right direction on his path to redemption. As the applause began to fade, Eli stood up, not to receive recognition, but to say what he firmly believed in his heart. He looked out at the audience, his familiar dark glasses still in place, but his face lit up with a gentle, confident, and calm smile. He didn't need praise or approval, because he knew the music had already said it all. "Music is the light that guides me," Eli said, his voice clear, carrying a sense of determination and clarity that not everyone possesses. The simple sentence held a powerful message about life and belief in human potential. Music wasn't just a passion, it was a guide, a light for those who know how to listen and feel. And for Eli, music was everything he needed to face any challenge life would bring. The audience applauded again, but this time not just for the perfection in music, but for the sincerity in Eli's word. They understood that Eli's story wasn't just about music, but about the triumph of faith and courage. The story had reached its conclusion, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one full of hope for every child like Eli, those who never give in to hardship. Victor looked at Eli, and his eyes held no regret, no guilt, only respect and admiration. He didn't need to say anything more, because this blind boy had said it all through his melodies, through words that came straight from the heart. Now, it was Eli's music that brought the story to its close, leaving the audience with a lasting lesson about the power of forgiveness, belief in humanity, and above all, the ability to see beauty in every person, whether they are flawed or not. The story ended in shared understanding and a simple but powerful truth: if people can change, then the world can change with them. The story of Eli Carter is a deeply inspiring journey of overcoming adversity and challenging society's prejudices. From a blind boy mocked and rejected by those considered powerful in the music world, Eli rose up and proved that real talent knows no limits. His first notes, gentle yet full of emotion, broke through the wall of doubt and division. The rejection from a prestigious music academy didn't defeat him, it only fueled his passion even more. He used music not only to express his own emotion, but also as a way to fight against the harsh standards society imposed on the disabled, on those deemed unworthy. Accompanying Eli on that journey was Victor Stein, a gifted teacher, a celebrated artist who had once been blinded by his own pride and prejudice. Victor's mistake wasn't just in rejecting a talent, but in turning music from a form of art into a tool for control and exclusion. However, Eli's presence, with his resilience and courage, forced Victor to confront his errors. Through Eli's inspiring performances and the support of the community, Victor gradually found his path to redemption. His public apology, his admission of wrongdoing, and the creation of a scholarship fund for children with disabilities were not merely attempts to appease public opinion, but a reflection of real change within himself. The community, from artists to social activists, stood with Eli and Victor on this journey. The scholarship fund was established not only to provide musical education to underprivileged and disabled children, but also to affirm that music is not reserved for privileged few. The benefit concerts for Eli were not just opportunities for audiences to enjoy music, but also chances for them to take part in a larger movement, a campaign for the rights and opportunities of disadvantaged children. Eli's story sparked a wave of change not only in the arts but also throughout society, as people came to see that talent does not depend on circumstances or physical appearance, but is a potential within every person. From a blind boy once looked down upon, Eli became a symbol of resilience and self-belief. Every time he took the stage, it was not just to perform, but to deliver a message of fairness, of refusing to leave anyone behind because of things beyond their control. Eli helped people realize that the world is not only made up of winners, but of those who are willing to change, who are willing to rise and make things right. Meanwhile, Victor was no longer the arrogant man people once knew. His transformation did not come from apologies, but from real actions to make amends for the mistakes he had made. The scholarship fund he created not only brought opportunities to young children, but also served as a statement that a person can change, can make up for past wrongs, and can give back to the community. Letting go of fame and rediscovering the true meaning of music and life made Victor a model of humility and remorse. He was no longer Eli's former mentor, but a friend, a new kind of teacher, one who had learned from his own student about patience and forgiveness. In the end, the story of Eli and Victor is proof that people can change, can rise after failure, and that it is never too late to start again. The lessons of forgiveness, perseverance, and courage apply not only to art, but to life itself. When society embraces differences, when each person is willing to reflect on themselves and the mistakes they have made, a fair and loving world will slowly take shape. The story of Eli and Victor does not end at a final point, but begins at the start of a long and promising road, where music is not just art, but a bridge between hearts, between people who know how to listen and understand one another.